Chapter 37 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3 by Arthur L. Hayward. Chapter 37. The Life of Samuel Armstrong, a Housebreaker. I have heretofore remarked the great danger there is in having a bad character and keeping ill company, from the probability of truth which it gives to every accusation that either malice or interest may induce men to bring against one. This malefactor was the son of parents in tolerable circumstances, who were careful of his education, and when he grew up, bound him to apprentice to Captain Matthews, commander of a vessel which traded to Guinea and the West Indies. He behaved at sea very well, and had not the least objection made to his character when he came home. Happy had it been for him if he had gone to sea again, without suffering himself to be tainted with the vices of this great city. Unfortunately for him, he fell in love with a young woman, and lived with her for some time as his wife. His fondness for this creature drew him to be guilty of those base actions which first brought him to Newgate and the bar at the Old Bailey, and so far blasted his character and unfortunately betrayed him to his death. In the company of this female he quickly lavished what little money he had, and not knowing how to get more, he fell into the persuasions of some wicked young fellows who advised him to take to robbing in the streets. Certain it is that he had not made many attempts, he himself said none, before he was apprehended, and that the first fact he was ever concerned in was stealing a man's hat and tobacco box in Thames Street. This was committed by his companion, who gave them to him, and then, running away, left him to be answerable for the fact, for which being indicted at the next sessions at the Old Bailey, he was found guilty. But it being a single felony only, it did not affect his life. However, having been seen there by one Holland, who turned evidence, he thought fit to save his own life by swearing him into the commission of a burglary, which himself and one Thomas Griffith actually committed. However, his oath being positive and the character of this unhappy lad so bad, the people who were robbed were induced to prosecute him with great vehemence, and the jury, on the same presumption, found him guilty. Griffith, who received sentence with him but afterwards had a pardon, acknowledged that he himself was guilty, but declared at the same time that this unhappy young man was absolutely clear of what was laid to his charge, Holland and himself being the only persons who committed that burglary, and took away the kitchen things which were sworn against him. Moreover, that Armstrong coming to Newgate and seeing Holland and speaking to him about something, Holland took that opportunity of asking who Armstrong was, and what he came there for. Being told the story of his conviction for the hat and wig, he thought fit to add him to his former information against Griffith, and so by swearing against two, effectually secured himself. In this story, both the unhappy person of whom we are speaking and Thomas Griffith, who was condemned for and confessed the fact, agreed, and Armstrong went to death, absolutely denying the fact for which he was to suffer. At the place of execution his color changed, and though at other times he appeared to be a bold young man, yet now his courage failed him. He trembled and turned pale, besought the people to pray for his soul, and in great agony and confusion, submitted to death on the 7th day of October, 1730, being at the time of his death about 22 years of age. End of chapter 37.
Chapter 38 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Millie, Glassbury. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. Chapter 38. The Life of Nicholas Gilburn, a most notorious highwayman. This unfortunate person was born at Ballingarry, near Limerick, in the west of Ireland, of parents in very tolerable circumstances, who gave him a very good education. But perceiving that he had a martial disposition, they resolved not to cross it, and therefore, though he was not above 14 years of age, got him recommended to an officer, who received him as a dragoon. He served about 4 years, with a very good reputation in the army, but he had a brother who then rode in a regiment of horse, who wrote to him from London, and encouraged him to come over into England, which occasioned his writing to his officer to desire his discharge. To this his officer readily agreed. He went thereupon from the north of Ireland to the west, to his friend, where having equipped himself with clothing, linen, and other necessaries, he then came to London, expecting to meet his brother. But on his arrival here he was disappointed, and that disappointment, together with his want of money, made him very uneasy. At last, in order to procure bread, he resolved to list himself in the Foot Guards. He did so, and continued in them for about 2 years, during which time he says in his dying declaration that he did duty as well, and appeared as clean as any man in the company. Nay, in all that time, he avers that he never neglected his guard but once, which was very fatal to him, for it brought him into the acquaintance of those who betrayed him to measures which cost him his life. For being taken up and carried to the Savoy for the aforementioned offence, he had not been long in prison before Wilson, who had been concerned with Burnworth, alias Fraser, and the rest in the murder of Mr. Ball in the Mint, and one Mr. G., an old highwayman, though he had never conversed with him before, came to pay him a visit. They treated him both with meat and drink, seemed to commiserate his condition very much, and promised him that he should not want 12 pence a day during the time in confinement. This promise was very well kept, and GILBURN in a few days obtained his liberty. The next day he met Wilson in St. James's Park, who, after complimenting him upon his happy deliverance, invited him to a house in Spring Gardens to drink and make merry together. GILBURN readily consented, and after discoursing of courage, want of money, the miseries of poverty, and some other preparatory articles, Wilson parted with him for that time, appointing another meeting with him at 11 o'clock the next morning. There Wilson pursued his former topic, and at last told him plainly that the best and shortest method to relieve their wants was to go on the highway, and when he had once made this step, he scrupled not to make a further, telling GILBURN that there was no such danger in those practices as was generally apprehended, for that with a little care and circumspection the gallows might be well enough avoided, which he said was plain enough from his own adventures, since he had lived several years in the profession, and by being cautious enough to look about him, had escaped any confinement. GILBURN heard this account with terror. He had never committed anything of this kind hitherto, and knew very well that if he once engaged, he could never afterwards go back. Wilson seemed not at all uneasy at his pause, but artfully introducing discourse on other subjects, plied him in the meanwhile with liquor, until he saw him pretty warm, and then resumed the story of his own adventures and of the facility of acquiring money when a man is but well stored with courage and has ever so little conduct. This artifice unfortunately had its effect, Wilson's conversation and the fumes of liquor prevailing so far upon GILBURN that, as he himself phrased it, he resolved at last upon business. The day following, GILBURN provided himself with pistols, and removed his quarters to go and live with Wilson, who encouraged him with all the arguments he was able to stick to his new profession, and GILBURN in return swore he would live and die with him. So at night they went out together in quest of adventures. The road they took was towards Paddington. A little after they were come into the fields, they attacked a gentleman and took from him 8 shillings, with which GILBURN was very much pleased, though they had little luck after, so that they returned at last to their lodgings, weary and fatigued, and were obliged to mount guard the next morning. When their guard was over, they were, as Mr. GILBURN expresses it in his last speech, as bare as a bird's arse. So no time was to be lost, and accordingly that very night they made their second expedition. Nobody coming in their way, GILBURN began to fret, and at last falling into a downright passion, swore he would rob the first man he met. He was as good as his word, and the booty he got proved a tolerable provision for some days. But guard day drawing nigh again, Wilson told him there was no mounting without money, and the same methods were taken as formerly. But as the leagues by which men are united in villainy are liable to 1,000 inconveniencies which are uneasily borne, and yet hard to be remedied. So Wilson's humours being very different from that of GILBURN, they soon began to differ about the money they acquired by plunder. At last, coming one night very much tired and fatigued to a public house where Wilson was acquainted, they called for some drink to refresh themselves, which, when they had done, GILBURN was for dividing the money, himself standing in need of linen and other necessaries. Wilson, on the other hand, was for having a bowl of punch, and words thereupon arose to such a height that at last they fell to fighting. This quarrel was irreconcilable, and they absolutely parted company, though GILBURN unfortunately pursued the same road, and having robbed a gentleman on horseback of several yards of fine paduasoy, he was shortly after apprehended and committed to Newgate. At first he absolutely denied the fact, but when he was convicted and saw no hopes of pardon, he acknowledged what had been sworn against him by the prosecutor to be true, attended with much gravity at chapel, and seemed to be greatly afflicted through a due sense of those many sins which he had committed. Wilson, his companion, had a little before been executed at Kingston, and GILBURN, with all outward signs of contrition, suffered the same death at Tyburn, at the same time with the before-mentioned malefactor, being at the time of his death about 22 years of age. End of chapter 38.
Chapter 39 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. Chapter 39. The Lives of James O'Brien, Hugh Morris, and Robert Johnson, Highwaymen and Street Robbers. Amongst the many flagrant vices of the present age, there is none more remarkable than the strange property we see in young people to commit the most notorious crimes, provided they may thereby furnish themselves with money enough to support their lavish expenses in vices, which in former times were scarce heard of by lads of that age at which our boldest highwaymen begin to exert themselves now. The first of these unfortunate lads, James O'Brien, was born at Dublin, was brought over hither young, and had a good education given him, which he had very little inclination to make a proper use of. Nothing could persuade him to go out to a trade. On the contrary, he pretended he would apply himself to his father's employment, which was that of a plasterer. But as working was required, he soon grew out of humour with it, and addicted himself wholly to strolling about the streets with such wicked lads as himself, and so was easily drawn in to think of supplying himself with money by the plunder of honest people, in order to carry on those debaucheries in which, though a lad, he was already deeply immersed. Women, forsooth, drew this spark away from the paths of virtue and goodness at about 16 years old, after which time he lost all sense of duty to his parents, respect of laws, divine or human, and even care of himself. It seems he found certain houses in Chick Lane, where they met abundance of loose young men and women, accustomed themselves to every kind of debauchery which it was possible for wicked people to commit, or the most fruitful genius to invent. Here he fell into the company of his two companions, Morris and Johnson. The first of these was the son of an unfortunate tradesman who had once kept a great shop, and lived in good reputation in the Strand, but through the common calamities of life, he was so unfortunate as to break, and, laying it too much to heart, died soon after it, happy, however, in one thing, that he did not live to see the deplorable end of his son by the hand of justice. Robert Johnson was the son of honest parents and had a very good education, but put it to a very ill use. For having all his lifetime been addicted to pilfering and thieving, at last he fell into the company of these unfortunate young men, who led him a directer way to the gallows than perhaps he might have found himself. One of his chief inducements to forfeit reputation and hazard life by engaging in street robberies was his commencing an amour with his father's servant maid, and not long after falling into a multitude of such-like adventures, the ready road to inevitable ruin. These three sparks, together with Bernard Fink and another person who turned evidence against them, came all at the same time to a resolution of attacking people in the streets, and having provided themselves with pistols and whatever else they thought necessary for putting their design in execution, they immediately set about it, and, though but boys, committed bolder and more numerous robberies than had ever hitherto been heard of. It may indeed seem surprising that lads of their age should be able to intimidate passengers, but when it is considered that, having less precaution than older rogues, they were more ready at firing pistols, or otherwise injuring those whom they attacked, than any set of fellows who had hitherto disturbed the crown, this wonder will wear off. It was not above 2 months that they continued their depredations, but in that time they had been exceedingly busy, and had committed a multitude of facts. One gentleman whom they attacked in Lincoln's Inn Fields refused to surrender, and drew his sword upon Morris. That young robber immediately fired his pistol, and the rest coming to his assistance, the gentleman thought it but prudent to retire, the noise they made having alarmed the watch, and so prevented his losing anything. After this it became a very common practice with them, as soon as they stopped anybody, to clap a pistol under their nose and bid them smell at it, while one of their companions, with 1,000 execrations, threatened to blow their brains out if they made the least resistance. As soon as the business of the night was over, they immediately adjourned to their places of rendezvous at Chick Lane, or to other houses of the same stamp elsewhere, and without the least consideration of the hazards they had run, squandered the wages of their villainies upon such impudent strumpets as for the lucre of a few shillings prostituted themselves to them in these debaucheries. Mr. O'Brien was the hero of this troop of infant robbers. He valued himself much on never meddling with small matters, or committing any meaner crime than that of the highway. It happened he had a mistress coming out of the country, and he would needs have his companions take each of them a doxy, and go with him as far as Windsor to receive her. They readily complied, and at Windsor they were all seized, and from thence brought to town, 2 of their own gang turning evidence, so that on the clearest proof they were all 3 convicted. Under sentence of death they behaved with great audacity, seemed to value themselves on the crimes they had committed, caused several disturbances at chapel, and discovered little or no sense of that miserable condition in which they were. O'Brien died a papist, and in the cart read with great earnestness a book of devotions in that way. He wrote a letter to his father the day before he died, and also something which he called verses to his sister, both of which I have subjoined verbatim, so that my readers may have the better idea of the capacity of those poor creatures. To Mr. Terence O'Brien, living in Burleigh Street in the Strand. Honoured Father and Mother, the uneasiness I give you is more terror to me than the thoughts of death, but pray make yourselves as easy as you can, for I hope I am going to a better place, for God is my refuge and my strength, and my helper in time of tribulation. And pray take care of my brother now whilst he is young, and make him serve God, and keep him out of bad company. If I had served God as I ought to have done, and kept out of bad company, I had not come to this unhappy misfortune, but I hope it is for the good of my soul. It is good, I hope, what God has at present ordained for me, for there is mercy in the foresight of death, and in the time God has given me to prepare for it. A natural death might have had less terror, for in that I might have wanted many advantages which are now granted me. My trust is in God, and I hope He won't reward me according to my deserts. All that I can suffer here must have an end, for this life is short, so are all the sufferings of it, but the next life is eternal. Pray give my love to my sister, and desire her not to neglect her duty to God. I hope you are all well, as I am at present, I thank God. So, no more at present. From your unhappy and undutiful son, James O'Brien. The verses sent by James O'Brien to his sister 2 days before his execution. My loving, tender sister dear, from you I soon must part, I fear. Think not on my wretched state, nor grieve for my unhappy fate, but serve the Lord with all your heart, and from you He'll never part. When I am dead and in my tomb, for my poor soul I hope there's room in heaven with God above on high. I hope to live eternally. At the time of their execution, James O'Brien was about 20, Hugh Morris 17, and Robert Johnson not full 20 years of age, which was on the 16th of November 1730. End of chapter 39.
Chapter 40 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren Randall. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. The History of the Life and Surprising Adventures of John Gow, alias Smith, a most notorious pirate and murderer. Part 1. The principal use to which a work of this nature can be applied is to engage persons to refuse the first stirrings of their passions, and the slighted emotions of vice in their breasts, since they see before their eyes so many sad examples of the fatal consequences which follow upon rash and wicked enterprises, of which the following history exhibits as extraordinary an instance as perhaps is any there to be found. In giving an account of this malefactor, we are obliged to begin with his embarking on board the vessel, which he afterwards seized and went a pirating in. It was called the George Galley, and was of about 200 tons burden, commanded by Oliver Furneaux, a Frenchman, but a subject of the Crown of England, who entertained this Gow as a private seaman only, but afterwards, to his great misfortune, preferred him to be the second mate in the voyage of which we are next to speak. Captain Furneaux, being a man of reputation among the merchants of Amsterdam, got a voyage for his ship from thence to Santa Cruz on the coast of Barbary, to load beeswax and to carry it to Genoa, which was his delivering port, and as the Dutch, having war with the Turks of Algiers, were willing to employ him as an English ship, so he was as willing to be manned with English seamen, and accordingly among the rest he unhappily took on board this Gow, with his wretched gang, such as Macaulay, Melvin, Williams, and others. But not being able to man themselves wholly with English or Scots, he was obliged to take some Swedes and other seamen to make his complement, which was 23 in all. Among the latter sort, one was named Winter, and another Peterson, both of them Swedes by nation, but wicked as Gow and his other fellows were. They sailed from the Texel in the month of August, 1724, and arrived at Santa Cruz on the 2nd of September following, where, having a supercargo on board, who took charge of the loading, and 4 chests of money to purchase it, they soon got the beeswax on board, and on the 3rd of November they appointed to set sail to pursue the voyage. That day, the ship having lain 2 months in the road at Santa Cruz taking in her lading, the captain made preparations to put to sea, and the usual signals for sailing having been given, some of the merchants from on shore, who had been concerned in furnishing the cargo, came on board in the forenoon to take their leave of the captain, and wish him a good voyage, as is usual on such occasions. Whether it was concerted by the whole gang beforehand, we know not, but while the captain was treating and entertaining the merchants under the awning upon the quarter-deck, as is the custom in those hot countries, 3 of the seamen, viz. Winter and Peterson, 2 Swedes, and Macaulay, a Scotchman, came rudely upon the quarter-deck, as if they took the opportunity because the merchants were present, believing the captain would not use any violence with them in the presence of the merchants. They made a long complaint of all their ill usage, and particularly of their provisions and allowance, as they said, being not sufficient nor such as was ordinarily made in other merchant ships, seeming to load the captain, Monsieur Furneaux, with being the occasion of it, and that he did it for his private gain, which however had not been true. If the fact had been true, the overplus of provisions, if the stores had been more than sufficient, belonged to the owners, not to the captain, at the end of the voyage, there being also a steward on board to take the account. In making this complaint, they seemed to direct their speech to the merchants as well as to the captain, as if they had been concerned in the ship, or as if desiring them to intercede for them with the captain, that they might have redress and a better allowance. The captain was highly provoked at this rudeness, as indeed he had reason, it being a double affront to him, as it was done in the view of the merchants, who were come on board to him to do him an honour at parting. However, he restrained his passion, and gave them not the least angry word, only that if they were aggrieved, they had no more to do but to let him have know of it, that if they were ill used, it was not by his order, that he would inquire into it, and if anything was amiss, it should be rectified. With which the seamen withdrew, seemingly well satisfied with his answer. About 5 the same evening, they unmoored the ship and hove short upon their best bower anchor, awaiting the land breeze, as is usual on that coast, to carry them out to sea. But instead of that, it fell stark calm, and the captain, fearing the ship would fall foul of her own anchor, ordered the mizzen topsail to be furled. Peterson, one of the malcontent seamen, being the nearest man at hand, seemed to go about it, but moved so carelessly and heavily that it appeared plainly he did not care whether it was done or no, and particularly as if he had a mind the captain should see it and take notice of it, which the captain did, for perceiving how awkwardly he went about it, he spoke a little tartly to him, and asked him what was the reason he did not stir a little and furl the sail. Peterson, as if he had waited for the question, answered in a surly tone, and with a kind of disdain, "So as we eat, so shall we work." This he spoke aloud, so that he might be sure the captain heard him, and the rest of the men also, and it was evident that as he spoke in plural numbers, we, so he spoke their minds as well as his own, and words which they all agreed to before. The captain, however, though he heard plain enough what he said, took not the least notice of it, or gave him the least reason to believe he had heard him, being not willing to begin a quarrel with the men, and knowing that if he took any notice at all of it, he must resent it and punish it too. Soon after this the calm went off, and the land breeze sprang up, and they immediately weighed and stood out to sea. But the captain, having had these 2 bustles with his men just at their putting to sea, was very uneasy in his mind, as indeed he had reason to be. And the same evening, soon after they were under sail, the mate being walking on the quarter-deck, he went, and taking 2 or 3 turns with him, told him how he had been used by the men, particularly how they affronted him before the merchants, and what an answer Peterson had given him on the quarter-deck when he ordered him to furl the mizzen topsail. The mate was as surprised at these things as the captain, and after some other discourse about it, in which it was their unhappiness not to be so private as they ought to have been in a case of such importance, the captain told him he thought it was absolutely necessary to have a quantity of small arms brought immediately into the great cabin, not only to defend themselves if there should be occasion, but also that he might be in a posture to correct those fellows for their insolence, especially should he meet with any more of it. The mate agreed that it was necessary to be done, and had they said no more, or said this more privately, all had been well, and the wicked design had been much more difficult, if not the execution of it effectually prevented. But 2 mistakes in this part was the ruin of them all. First, that the captain spoke it without due caution, so that Winter and Peterson, the two principal malcontents, who were expressly mentioned by the captain to be corrected, overheard it, and knew by that means what they had to expect if they did not immediately bestir themselves to prevent it. The other mistake was that when the captain and mate agreed that it was necessary to have arms got ready and brought into the great cabin, the captain unhappily bid him go immediately to Gow, the second mate and gunner, and give him orders to get the arms cleared and loaded for him, and to bring them up to the great cabin, which was in short to tell the conspirators that the captain was preparing to be too strong for them, if they did not fall to work with him immediately. Winter and Peterson went immediately forward, where they knew the rest of the mutineers were, and to whom they communicated what they had heard, telling them that it was time to provide for their own safety, for otherwise their destruction was resolved on, and the captain would soon be in such a posture that there would be no muddling with him. While they were thus consulting, as they said, only for their own safety, Gow and Williams came into them with some others to the number of 8, and no sooner were they joined by these two, but they fell downright to the point which Gow had so long formed in his own mind, viz., to seize upon the captain and mate, and all those that they could not bring to join with them. In short, to throw them into the sea, and to go upon the account. All those who are acquainted with the sea language know the meaning of that expression, and that it is, in few words, to run away with the ship and turn pirates. Villainous designs are soonest concluded, as they had but little time to consult upon what measures they should take. So very little consultation served for what was before them, and they came to this short but hellish resolution, viz., that they would immediately, that very night, murder the captain and such others as they named, and afterwards proceed with the ship as they should see cause. And here it is to be observed that though Winter and Peterson were in the first proposal, namely to prevent their being brought to correction by the captain, yet Gow and Williams were the principal advisers in the bloody part, which however the rest came into soon. For, as I said before, as they had but little time to resolve in, so they had but very little debate about it, but what was first proposed was forthwith engaged in and consented to. It must not be omitted that Gow had always had the wicked game of pirating in his head, and that he had attempted it, or rather tried to attempt it before, but was not able to bring it to pass. So he and Williams had also several times, even in this very voyage, dropped some hints of this vile design, as they thought there was room for it, and touched 2 or 3 times at what a noble opportunity they had of enriching themselves, and making their fortunes, as they wickedly called it. This was when they had the 4 chests of money on board, and Williams made it a kind of jest in his discourse, how easily they might carry it off, ship and all. But as they did not find themselves seconded, or that any of the men showed themselves in favor of such a thing, but rather spoke of it with abhorrence, they passed it over as a kind of discourse that had nothing at all in it, except that one of the men, viz. The surgeon, once took them up short for so much as mentioning such a thing, told them the thought was criminal, and it ought not to be spoken of among them, which reproof was supposed cost him his life afterwards. As Gow and his comrade had thus started the thing at a distance before, though it was then without success, yet they had the less to do now, when other discontents had raised a secret fire in the breasts of the men, for now, being as it were mad and desperate with apprehensions of their being severely punished by the captain, they wanted no persuasions to come into the most wicked undertaking that the devil or any of his angels could propose to them. Nor do we find that upon any of their examinations they pretended to have made any scruples or objections to the cruelty of the bloody attempt that was to be made, but came to it at once, and resolved to put it in execution immediately, that is to say, the very same evening. It was the captain's constant custom to call all the ship's company into the great cabin every night at 8 o'clock to prayers, and then the watch being set, one went upon deck and the other turned in, or, as the seamen phrase it, went to their hammocks to sleep, and here they concerted their devilish plot. It was the turn of 5 of the conspirators to go to sleep, and of these Gow and Williams were 2. The 3 who were to be upon the deck were Winter, Rowlandson, and Melvin, a Scotchman. The persons they immediately designed for destruction were four, viz., the captain, the mate, the supercargo, and the surgeon, whereof all but the captain were gone to sleep, the captain himself being upon the quarter-deck. Between 9 and 10 at night, all being quiet and secure, and the poor gentlemen that were to be murdered fast asleep, the villains that were below gave the watchword, which was, "Who fires next?" At which they all got out of their hammocks with as little noise as they could, and going in the dark to the hammocks of the chief mate, supercargo, and surgeon, they cut all their throats. The surgeon's throat was cut so effectually that he could struggle very little with them, but leaping out of his hammock, ran up to get upon the deck, holding his hand upon his throat. But he stumbled at the tiller, and falling down had no breath, and consequently no strength to raise himself, but died where he lay. The mate, whose throat was cut but not his windpipe, struggled so vigorously with the villain who attacked him that he got away from him and into the hold, and the supercargo, in the same condition, got forwards between decks under some deals, and both of them begged with the most moving cries and entreaties for their lives. And when nothing could prevail, they begged with the same earnestness for but a few moments to pray to God and recommend their souls to mercy, but alike in vain. For the wretched murderers, heated with blood, were past pity, and not being able to come at them with their knives, with which they had begun the execution, they shot them with their pistols, firing several times upon each of them until they found they were quite dead. As all this, even before the firing, could not be done without some noise, the captain, who was walking alone upon the quarter-deck, called out and asked what was the matter. The boatswain, who sat on the after-bitts, and was not of the party, answered he could not tell, but he was afraid there was somebody overboard, upon which the captain stepped towards the ship's side to look over. Then Winter, Rowlandson, and Melvin, coming that moment behind him, laid hands on him, and lifting him up, attempted to throw him overboard into the sea. But he, being a nimble, strong man, got hold of the shrouds and struggled so hard with them that they could not break his hold. Turning his head to look behind him to see who he had to deal with, one of them cut his throat with a broad Dutch knife, but neither was that wound mortal, for the captain still struggled with them, and seeing he should undoubtedly be murdered, he constantly cried up to God for mercy, for he found there was none to be expected from them. During this struggle, another of the murderers stabbed him with a knife in the back, and that with such a force that the villain could not draw the knife out again to repeat his blow, which he would otherwise have done. At this moment Gow came up from the butchery he had been at between decks, and seeing the captain still alive, he went close up to him and shot him, as he confessed, with a brace of bullets. What part he shot him in could not be known, though they said he had shot him in the head. However, he had yet life enough, though they threw him overboard, to take hold of a rope, and would still have saved himself, but they cut that rope, and then he fell into the sea, and was seen no more. Thus they finished the tragedy, having murdered 4 of the principal men in command in the ship, so that there was nobody now to oppose them. For Gow, being second mate and gunner, the command fell to him, of course, and the rest of the men, having no arms ready, not knowing how to get at any, were in utmost consternation, expecting they would go on with the work and cut their throats. In this fright everyone shifted for himself. As for those who were upon deck, some got up in the round tops, others got into the ship's head, resolving to throw themselves into the sea rather than be mangled with knives and murdered as the captain and mate, etc., had been. Those who were below, not knowing what to do, or whose turn it should be next, lay still in their hammocks, expecting death every moment, and not daring to stir, lest the villains should think they did it in order to make resistance, which however they were in no way capable of doing, having no concert with one another, not knowing anything in particular of one another, as who was alive or who was dead. Had the captain, who was himself a bold and stout man, been in his great cabin with 3 or 4 men with him and his firearms, as he intended to have had, those 8 fellows had never been able to have done their work. But every man was taken unprovided and in the utmost surprise, so that the murderers met with no resistance, and as for those what were left, They were less able to make resistance than the other, so that, as has been said, they were in the utmost terror and amazement, expecting every minute to be murdered as the rest had been. But the villains had done. The persons who had any command were dispatched, so they cooled a little as to blood. The first thing they did afterwards was to call up all the 8 upon the quarter-deck, where they congratulated one another and shook hands together, engaging to proceed by joint consent in their resolved design, that is, of turning pirates. In order to which they unanimously chose Gow to command the ship, promising all subjection and obedience to his orders, so that we must now call him Captain Gow, and he, by the same consent of the rest, named Williams his lieutenant. Other officers they appointed afterwards. The first orders they issued was to let all the rest of the men know that if they continued quiet and offered not to meddle with any of their affairs, they should receive no hurt, but chiefly forbade any man to set a foot abaft the main mast, except they were called to the helm, upon pain of being immediately cut to pieces, keeping for that purpose one man at the steerage door, and one upon the quarter-deck with drawn cutlasses in their hands. But there was no need for it, for the men were so terrified with the bloody doings they had seen, that they never offered to come in sight until they were called. Their next work was to throw overboard the 3 dead bodies of the mate, the surgeon, and the supercargo, which they said lay in their way. That was soon done, their pockets being first searched and rifled. From thence they went to work with the great cabin and with all the lockers, chests, boxes, and trunks. These they broke open and rifled, that is, such of them as belonged to the murdered persons, and whatever they found there they shared among themselves. When they had done this, they called for liquor, and sat down to drinking until morning, leaving the men, as above, to keep guard, and particularly to guard the arms, but relieved them from time to time as they saw occasion. By this time they had drawn in 4 more of the men to approve of what they had done, and promised to join with them, so that now there were 12 in number, and being but 24 at first, whereof 4 were murdered, they had but 8 men to be apprehensive of, and those they could easily look after. So the next day they sent for them all to appear before their new captain, where they were told by Gow what his resolution was, viz., to go a-cruising, or to go upon the account. If they were willing to join with them and go into their measures, they should be well used, and there should be no distinction among them, but they should all fare alike. He said that they had been forced to do what they had done by the barbarous usage of Furneaux, but that there was now no looking back, and therefore, as they had not been concerned in what was past, they had nothing to do but to act in concert, do their duty as sailors, and obey orders for the good of the ship, and no harm should come to any of them. As they all looked like condemned prisoners brought up to the bar to receive sentence of death, so they all answered by a profound silence, which Gow took as they meant it, viz., as a consent, because they durst not refuse. So they were then permitted to go up and down everywhere as they used to do, though such of them as sometimes afterwards showed any reluctance to act as principals were never trusted, always suspected, and very often severely beaten. Some of them were in many ways inhumanely treated, and that particularly by Williams, the lieutenant, who was in his nature a merciless, cruel, and inexorable wretch, as we shall have occasion to take notice of again in its place. They were now in a new circumstance of life, and acting upon a different stage of business, though upon the same stage as to the element, the water. Before they were a merchant ship, laden upon a good account, with merchants' goods from the coast of Barbary, and bound to the coast of Italy. But they were now a crew of pirates, or as they call them in the Levant, corsairs, bound nowhere but to look out for purchase and spoil wherever they could find it. In pursuit of this wicked trade, they first changed the name of the ship, which was before called the George Galley, and which they called now the Revenge, a name indeed suitable to the bloody steps they had taken. In the next place, they made the best of the ship's forces. The ship had but 12 guns mounted when they came out of Holland, but as they had 6 more good guns in the hold, with cartridges and everything proper for service, which they had in store through being freighted for the Dutch merchants, and the Algerians being at war with the Dutch. They supposed they might want them for defense. Now they took care to mount them for a much worse design, so that now they had 18 guns, though too many for the number of hands they had on board. In the third place, instead of pursuing their voyage to Genoa with the ship's cargo, they took a clear contrary course, and resolved to station themselves upon the coasts of Spain and Portugal, and to cruise upon all nations. But what they chiefly aimed at was a ship with wine, if possible, for that they wanted extremely. The first prize they took was an English sloop belonging to Poole, Thomas Wise, commander, bound from Newfoundland with fish for Cadiz. This was a prize of no value to them, so they took out the master, Mr. Wise, and his men, who were but 5 in number, with their anchors, cables, and sails, and what else they found worth taking, and sunk the vessel. The next prize they took was a Scotch vessel bound from Glasgow, with herrings and salmon from thence to Genoa, and commanded by one Mr. John Somerville of Port Patrick. This vessel was likewise of little value to them, except that they took as they had done from the other, their arms, ammunition, clothes, provisions, sails, anchors, cables, etc., and everything of value, and sunk her too as they had done the sloop. The reason they gave for sinking these 2 vessels was to prevent their being discovered, for as they were now cruising on the coast of Portugal, had they let their ships have gone with several of their men on board, they would presently have stood in for shore, and have given the alarm. And the men of war, of which there were several as well Dutch as English in the river of Lisbon, would immediately have put out to sea in quest of them, and they were very unwilling to leave the coast of Portugal until they had got a ship with wine, which they very much wanted. After this they cruised 8 or 10 days without seeing so much as one vessel upon the seas, and were just resolving to stand more to the coast of Galicia when they descried a sail to the southward, being a ship about as big as their own, though they could not perceive what force she had. However, they gave chase, and the vessel, perceiving it, crowded from them with all the sail they could make, hoisting up French colors, and standing away to the southward. They continued the chase 3 days and nights, and though they did not gain much upon her, the Frenchmen sailing very well, yet they kept her in sight all the while, and for the most part within gunshot. But the 3rd night, the weather proving a little hazy, the Frenchmen changed her course in the night, and so got clear of them, and good reason they had to bless themselves in the escape they had made. If they had but known what a dreadful crew of rogues they had fallen among if they had been taken. They were now gotten a long way to the southward, and being greatly disappointed, and in want of water as well as wine, they resolved to stand away for the Madeiras, which they knew were not far off. So they accordingly made the island in 2 days more, and keeping a large offing, they cruised for 3 or 4 days more, expecting to meet with some Portuguese vessel going in or coming out. But it was in vain, for nothing stirred. So, tired with waiting, they stood in for the road, and came to anchor, though at a great distance. Then they sent their boat towards the shore with 7 men, all well armed, to see whether it might not be practicable to board one of the ships in the road, and cutting her away from her anchors, bring her off. Or if they found that could not be done, then their orders were to intercept some of the boats belonging to the place, which carry wines on board the ships in the road, or from one place to another on the coast. But they came back again disappointed in both, everybody being alarmed and aware of them, knowing by their posture what they were. Having thus spent several days to no purpose, and finding themselves discovered at last, being apparently under a necessity to make an attempt somewhere, they stood away for Porto Santo, the most northerly of the islands, about 10 leagues to the windward of Madeiras, and belonging also to the Portuguese. Here, putting up British colors, they sent their boat ashore with Captain Somerville's bill of health, and a present to the governor of 3 barrels of salmon, and 6 barrels of herrings, and a very civil message, desiring leave to water, and to buy some refreshments, pretending to be bound to. The governor very courteously granted their desire, but with more courtesy than discretion went off himself, with about 9 or 10 of his principal people, to pay the English captain a visit, little thinking what kind of a captain it was they were going to compliment, and what price it might have cost them. However, Gow, handsomely dressed, received them with some ceremony, and entertained them tolerably well for a while. But the governor, having been kept as long by civility as they could, and the refreshments from the shore not appearing, he was forced to unmask, and when the governor and his company rose up to take their leave, to their great surprise, they were suddenly surrounded with a gang of fellows with muskets, and an officer at the head of them. These told them, in so many words, they were the captain's prisoners, and must not think of going on shore any more until the water and provisions, which were promised, should come on board. It is impossible to conceive the consternation and surprise the Portuguese gentry were in, nor is it very decently to be expressed. The poor governor was so much more than half dead with fright that he really befouled himself in a piteous manner, and the rest were in not much better condition. They trembled, cried, begged, crossed themselves, and said their prayers as men going to execution, but it was all one. They were told flatly that the captain was not to be trifled with, that the ship was in want of provisions, and they would have them, or they should carry them all away. They were, however, well enough treated, except for the restraint of their persons, and were often asked to refresh themselves, but they would neither eat nor drink any more all the while they stayed on board, which was until the next day in the evening, when to their great satisfaction they saw a great boat come off from the fort, and which came directly on board with 7 butts of water, a cow and a calf, and a good number of fowls. When the boat came alongside and delivered the stores, Captain Gow complimented the governor and his gentlemen, and discharged them to their great joy, and besides that gave them in return for their provisions 2 sarons of beeswax, and fired them 3 guns at their going away. It is to be supposed they would have a care how they went on board any ship again, in compliment to their captain, unless they were very sure who they were. Having had no better success in this out-of-the-way run to the Madeiras, they resolved to make the best of their way back again to the coast of Spain and Portugal. They accordingly left Porto Santo next morning with a fair wind, standing directly for Cape St. Vincent, or the southward cape. They had not been upon the coast of Spain above 2 or 3 days before they met with a New England ship, one cross-commander laden with slaves, and bound for Lisbon, being to load there with wine for London. This was also a prize of no value to them, and they began to be very much discouraged with their bad fortune. However, they took out Captain Cross and his men, which were 7 or 8 in number, with most of the provisions and some of the sails, and gave the ship to Captain Wise, the poor man whom they took at first in a sloop from Newfoundland, and in order to pay Wise and his men for what they took from them, and make them satisfaction, as they called it, they gave to Captain Wise and his mate 24 sarons of wax, and to his men, who were 4 in number, 2 sarons of wax each. Thus they pretended honesty, and to make reparation of damages by giving them the goods which they had robbed the Dutch merchants of, whose supercargo they had murdered. The day before the division of the spoil, they saw a large ship to windward, which at first put them into some surprise, for she came bearing down directly upon them, and they thought she had been a Portuguese man-of-war. But they found soon after that it was a merchant ship, had French colors, and bound home, as they supposed from the West Indies, and so it was, for they afterwards learned that she was laden at Martinico and bound for Rochelle. The Frenchmen, not fearing them, came on large to the wind, being a ship of much greater force than Gow's ship, carrying 32 guns and 80 men, besides a great many passengers. However, Gow at first made as if he would lie by for them, but seeing plainly what a ship it was, and that they should have their hands full of her, he began to consider, and calling his men together upon the deck, told them what was in his mind, viz., that the Frenchman was apparently superior in force in every way, that they were but ill manned, and had a great many prisoners on board, and that some of their own people were not very well to be trusted, that 6 of their best hands were on board the prize, and that all they had left were not sufficient to ply their guns and stand by the sails, and that therefore as they were under no necessity to engage, so he thought it would be next to madness to think of it. The generality of the men were of Gow's mind, and agreed to decline the fight, but Williams, his lieutenant, strenuously opposed it. And being not to be appeased by all that Gow could say to him, or anyone else, flew out into a rage at Gow, upbraiding him with being a coward and not fit to command a ship of force. The truth is, Gow's reasoning was good, and the thing was just, considering their own condition. But Williams was a fellow incapable of any solid thinking, had a kind of savage, brutal courage, but nothing of true bravery in him, and this made him the most desperate and outrageous villain in the world, and the most cruel and inhumane to those whose disaster it was to fall into his hands, as had frequently appeared in his usage of the prisoners under his power in this very voyage. Gow was a man of temper, and notwithstanding all the ill language Williams gave him, said little or nothing but by way of argument against attacking the French ship, which would certainly have been too strong for them. But this provoked Williams the more, and he grew so extraordinary in height that he demanded boldly of Gow to give his orders for fighting, which Gow declining still, Williams presented his pistol at him and snapped it, but it did not go off, which enraged him the more. Winter and Peterson, standing nearest to Williams, and seeing him so furious, flew at him immediately, and each of them fired a pistol at him. One shot him through the arm, and the other into his belly, at which he fell, and the men about him laid hold of him to throw him overboard, believing he was dead. But as they lifted him up, he started violently out of their hands, and leaped directly into the hold, and from thence ran desperately into the powder room, with his pistol cocked in his hand, swearing he would blow them all up. He had certainly done it, if they had not seized him just as he had gotten the scuttle open, and was that moment going to put his hellish resolution into practice. Having thus secured the distracted, raving creature, they carried him forward to the place which they had made on purpose between decks to secure their prisoners, and put him amongst them, having first loaded him with irons, and particularly handcuffed him with his hands behind him, to the great satisfaction of the other prisoners, who, knowing what a butcherly furious fellow he was, were terrified to the last degree to see him coming in among them, until they beheld the condition he came in. He was indeed the terror of all the prisoners, for he usually treated them in a barbarous manner, without the least provocation, and merely for his humor, presenting pistols to their breasts, swearing he would shoot them that moment, and then would beat them unmercifully, and all for his diversion, as he called it. Having thus laid him fast, they presently resolved to stand away to the westward, by which they quitted the Martinico ship, who by that time was come nearer to them, and farther convinced them they were in no condition to have engaged her, for she was a stout ship, and full of men. All this happened just the day before they shared their last prize among the prisoners, in which they put on such a mock face of doing justice to the several captains and mates and other men, their prisoners, whose ships they had taken away, and to whom now they made reparation, by giving them what they had taken violently from another, so that it was a strange medley of mock justice, made up of rapine and generosity blended together. 2 days after this they took a Bristol ship bound from Newfoundland to a Porto with fish. They let her cargo alone, for they had no occasion for fish, but they took out almost all their provisions, all the ammunition, arms, etc., and her good sails, also her best cables, and forced 2 of her men to go away with them, and then got 10 of the Frenchmen on board and let her go. But just as they were parting with her, they consulted together what to do with Williams the lieutenant, who was then among the prisoners and in irons, and after a short debate they resolved to put him on board the Bristol man and send him away too, which accordingly was done, with directions to the master to deliver him on board the first English man-of-war they should meet with, in order to get his being hanged for a pirate, as they jeeringly called him, as soon as he came to England, giving the master an account of some of his villainies. The truth is, this Williams was a monster rather than a man. He was the most inhumane, bloody, and desperate creature that the world could produce, and was even too wicked for Gow and all his crew. Though they pirates and murderers, as has been shown, his temper was so savage, so villainous, so merciless, that even the pirates themselves told him it was time he was hanged out of the way. One instance of the barbarity of Williams cannot be omitted, and will be sufficient to justify all that can be said of him. When Gow gave it as a reason against engaging with the Martinico ship that he had a great many prisoners on board, and some of their own men that they could not depend on, Williams proposed to have them all called up one by one, and to cut their throats and throw them overboard, a proposal so horrid that the worst of the crew shook their heads at it. Gow answered him very handsomely that there had been too much blood spilled already. Yet the refusing this heightened the quarrel, and was the chief occasion of his offering to pistol Gow himself, after which his behavior was such as made all the ship's crew resolve to be rid of him, and it was thought if they had not had an opportunity to send him away as they did by the Bristol ship, they would have been obliged to have hanged him themselves. This cruel and butchery temper of Williams being carried to such a height, and so near to the ruin of them all, shocked some of them, and as they acknowledged, gave some check in the heat of their wicked progress, and had they had an opportunity to have gone on shore at that time, without falling into the hands of justice, it is believed the greatest part of them would have abandoned the ship, and perhaps the very trade of a pirate too. But they had dipped their hands in blood, and heaven had no doubt determined to bring them, that is, the chief of them, to the gallows for it, as indeed they all deserved. So they went on. When they put Williams on board the Bristol man, and he was told what directions they gave with him, he began to relent, and made all the intercession he could to Captain Gow for pardon, or at least not to be put on board the ship, knowing that if he was carried to Lisbon, he should meet with his due from the Portuguese, if not from the English. For it seems he had been concerned in some villainies among the Portuguese before he came on board the George galley. What they were he did not confess, nor indeed did his own ship's crew trouble themselves to examine him about it. He had been wicked enough among them, and it was sufficient to make them use him as they did. It was more to be wondered, indeed, that they did not cut him to pieces upon the spot and throw him into the sea, half on one side of the ship and half on the other. For there was scarce a man in the ship, but on one occasion or other had some apprehensions of him, and might be said to go in danger of his life from him. But they chose to shift their hands of him this bloodless way, so they double fettered him and brought him up. When they brought him among the men, he begged they would throw him into the sea and drown him, then entreated for his life with a meanness which made them despise him, and with tears, so that one time they began to relent. But then the devilish temper of the fellow overruled it again, so at last they resolved to let him go, and did accordingly put him on board, and gave him many a hearty curse at parting, wishing him a good voyage to the gallows, which was made good afterwards, though in such company as they little thought of at that time. The Bristol captain was very just to him, for according to their orders, as soon as they came to Lisbon, they put him on board the Argyle, one of his Majesty's ships, Captain Bowles commander, then lying in the Tagus and bound home for England, who accordingly brought him home, though, as it happened, heaven brought the captain and the rest of the crew so quickly to an end of their villainies that they all came home time enough to be hanged with their lieutenant. But to return to Gow and his crew. Having thus dismissed the Bristol man and cleared his hands of most of his prisoners, with the same wicked generosity he gave the Bristol captain 13 sarons of beeswax, as a gratuity for his trouble and charge with the prisoners, and in recompense, as he called it, for the goods he had taken from him, and so they parted. This was the last prize they took, not only on the coast of Portugal, but anywhere else for Gow, who, to give him his due, was a fellow of counsel and had a great presence of mind in cases of exigence, considered that as soon as the Bristol ship came into the river of Lisbon, they would certainly give an account of them, as well of their strength, and of their station in which they cruised, and that consequently the English men of war, of which there are generally some in that river, would immediately come abroad to look for them. So he began to reason with his officers that the coast of Portugal would be no proper place at all for them, unless they resolved to fall into the hands of the said men of war, and they ought to consider immediately what to do. In these debates, some advised one thing, some another, as is usual in like cases. Some were for going to the coast of Guinea, where, as they said, was purchase. The word is here used in its original sense, indicating something acquired by seeking or hunting, pour chasser, enough and very rich ships to be taken. Others were going to the West Indies and to cruise among the islands, and take up their station at Tobago. Others, and not those of the most ignorant, proposed standing in to the Bay of Mexico, and joining in with some of a new sort of pirates at St. Iago de la Cuba, who were all Spaniards, and called themselves Guarda del Costa, that is, guard ships for the coast. Though under that pretense they make prize of ships of all nations, and sometimes even of their own countrymen too, but especially of the English. But when this was proposed, it was answered they durst not trust the Spaniards. Others said they should go first to the islands of New Providence, Bahama Islands, or to the mouth of the Gulf of Florida, and then cruising on the coast of North America, and making their retreat at New Providence, cruise from the Gulf of Florida north upon the coast of Carolina, and as high as the Capes of Virginia. But nothing could be resolved on, until at last Gow let them into the secret of a project, which, as he told them, he had long had in his thoughts, and this was to go away to the north of Scotland, near the coast of which, as he said, he was born and bred, and where he said, if they met with no purchase upon the sea, he could tell them how they should enrich themselves by going on shore. To bring them to concur with this design, he represented the danger they were in where they were, the want they were in of fresh water, and of several kinds of provisions, but above all the necessity they were in of careening and cleaning their ship, that it was too long a run for them to go to southward, and that they had not provisions to serve them till they could reach to any place proper for that purpose, and might be driven to the utmost distress if they should be put by from watering, either by weather or enemies. End of Chapter 40. Recording by Lauren Randall. Chapter 41 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lauren Randall. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. The History of the Life and Surprising Adventures of John Gow, alias Smith, a most notorious pirate and murderer, Part 2. Also, he told them, if any of the men of war came out in search of them, they would never imagine they were gone away to the northward, so that their run that way was perfectly secure, and he could assure them of his own knowledge, that if they landed in such places as he should direct, they could not fail of considerable booty in plundering some gentlemen's houses, who lived secured and unguarded very near the shore, and that though the country should be alarmed, yet before the government could send any men of war to attack them, they might clean their ship, lay in a store of fresh provisions, and be gone. Beside that, they would get a good many stout fellows to go along with them, upon his encouragement, so that they should be better manned than they were yet, and should be ready against all events. These arguments and their approaching fate concurring had a sufficient influence on the ship's company to prevail on them to consent. So they made the best of their way to the northward, and about the middle of January they arrived at Carristown, the island of Carrick, in the Isles of Orkney, and came to an anchor in a place which Gow told them was safe, riding under the lee of a small island at some distance from the port. But now their misfortunes began to come on, and things looked but with an indifferent aspect upon them, for several of their men, especially such of them as had been forced or decoyed into their service, began to think of making their escape from them, and to cast about for means to bring it to pass. The first to take an opportunity to go away was a young man, who was originally one of the ship's company, but was forced by fear of being murdered, as has been observed, to give a silent assent to go with them. It was one evening when the boat went on shore, for they kept a civil correspondence with the people of the town, that this young fellow, being one of the ship's crew, and having been several times on shore before, and therefore not suspected, gave them the slip, and got away to a farmhouse which lay under a hill out of sight. There, for 2 or 3 pieces of 8, he got a horse, and soon by that means escaped to Kirkwall, a market town and chief of the Orkneys, about 12 miles from the place where the ship lay. As soon as he came there, he surrendered himself to the government, desiring protection, and informed them who Gow was, and what the ship's crew were, and upon what business they were abroad, with what else he knew of their designs as to plundering the gentlemen's houses, etc. Upon this they immediately raised the country, and got a strength together to defend themselves. But the next disaster that attended the pirates, for misfortunes seldom come alone, was more fatal than this. For 10 of Gow's men, most of them likewise forced into their service, went away with a longboat, making the best of their way for the mainland of Scotland. These men, however they did it, or what shift soever they made to get so far, were taken in the Firth of Edinburgh, and made prisoners there. Hardened for his own destruction and justice evidently pursuing him, Gow grew the bolder for the disaster, and notwithstanding that the country was alarmed, and that he was fully discovered, instead of making a timely escape, he resolved to land, and so put his intended project of plundering the gentlemen's houses into execution, whatever it cost him. In order to this, he sent the boatswain and 10 men on shore the very same night, very well armed, directing them to go to the house of Mr. Honeyman of Grahamsey, sheriff of the county, and who was himself at that time, to his great good fortune, from home. The people of the house had not the least notice of their coming, so that when they knocked at the door, it was immediately opened, upon which they all entered the house at once, except one Panton, whom they set sentinel, and ordered him to stand at the door to secure their retreat, and to hinder any from coming in after them. Mrs. Honeyman and her daughter were extremely frightened at the sight of so many armed men coming into the house, and ran screaming about like people distracted, while the pirates, not regarding them, were looking about for chests and trunks, where they might expect to find some plunder. And Mrs. Honeyman, in her fright, coming to the door, asked Panton, the man who stood sentinel there, what the meaning of it all was. He told her freely they were pirates, and that they came to plunder her house. At this she recovered some courage, and ran back into the house immediately, and knowing where her money lay, which was very considerable, and all in gold, she put the bag in her lap, and boldly rushing by Panton, who thought she was only running from them in a fright, carried it all off, and so made her escape with the treasure. The boatswain, being informed that the money was carried off, resolved to revenge himself by burning the writings and papers, which they call there the charters of their estates, and are always of great value in gentlemen's houses of estates. But the young lady, Mr. Honeyman's daughter, hearing them threaten to burn the writings, watched her opportunity, and running to the charter room where they lay, tied the most considerable of them up in a napkin, and threw them out of the window, jumped out after them herself, and escaped without damage, though the window was 1 story high at least. However, the pirates had the plundering of all the rest of the house besides, and carried off a great deal of plate and things of value, and forced one of the servants, who played very well on the bagpipes, to march along, piping before them, when they carried it off to the ship. The next day they weighed anchor, intending, though they had cleaned but one side of the ship, to put out to sea and quit the coast. But sailing eastward, they came to anchor again at a little island called Calf Sound. And having some further mischief in their view, here the boatswain went on shore again with some armed men, but meeting with no other plunder, they carried off 3 women, whom they kept on board some time, and used so inhumanely, that when they set them on shore again, they were not able to go or stand, and it is said one of them died on the beach where they left them. The next day they weighed again, holding the same course eastward, through the openings between the islands, till they came off Ross Ness, and now Gow resolved to make the best of his way for the island of a day, to plunder the house of Mr. Fay, a gentleman of a considerable estate, and with whom Gow had some acquaintance, having been at school together when they were youths. On the 13th of February, in the morning, Gow appearing with his ship off Calf Sound, Mr. Fay and his family were very much alarmed, not being able to get together above 6 or 7 men for his defense. He therefore wrote a letter to Gow, intending to send it on board as soon as he should get into the harbor, to desire him to forbear the usual salutes with his great guns, because Mrs. Fay, his wife, was so very much indisposed, and this as he would oblige his old schoolfellow, telling him at the same time that the inhabitants were all fled to the mountains on the report of his being a pirate, which he hoped would not prove true, in which case he should be very ready to supply him with all such necessities as the island would afford, desiring him to send the messengers safe back, at whose return the alarms of the people would immediately be at an end. The tide, it seems, runs extremely rapid among those islands, and the navigation is thereby rendered very dangerous and uncertain. Gow was an able seaman, but was no pilot for that place, and which was worse, he had no boat to assist in case of extremity to wear the ship, and in turning into Calf Sound, he stood a little too near the point of a little island called the Calf, and which lay in the middle of the passage. Here his ship, missing stays, was in great danger of going on shore, to avoid which he dropped an anchor under his foot, which taking good hold brought him up, and he thought the danger was over. Gow was yet in distress, and had no remedy but to send his small boat on shore to Mr. Fay, to desire his assistance, that is to say, to desire him to lend him a boat to carry out an anchor and heave off the ship. Mr. Fay sent back the boat and one James Laying in it, with a letter already mentioned. Gow sent him back immediately with an answer, by word of mouth, viz., that he would write to nobody, but if Mr. Fay would order his people to assist him with a boat to carry out an anchor, he would reward them handsomely. In the meantime, Mr. Fay ordered his great boat, for he had such a one as Gow wanted, to be staved and launched into the water and sunk, and the masts, sails, and oars to be carried out of sight. While this was doing, Mr. Fay perceived Gow's boat coming on shore, with 5 persons in her. These men, having landed on the main island, left their boat on the beach, and altogether marched directly up to the mansion house. This put him into some surprise at first. However, he resolved to meet them in a peaceable manner, though he perceived they were all double armed. When he came up to them, he entreated them not to go up to the house, because of the languishing condition of his wife, who was already frightened with the rumors which had been raised of their being pirates, and that she would certainly die with the fear she was in for herself and family, if they came to the door. The boatswain answered they did not desire to fright his wife or anybody else, but they came to desire the assistance of his boat, and if he would not grant them so small a favor, he had nothing to expect from them but the utmost extremity. Mr. Fay returned that they knew well enough he could not venture to give them or lend them his boat or any help, as they appeared to be such people as were reported, but that if they would take them by force, he could not help himself. But in the meantime, talking still in a friendly manner to them, he asked them to go to a neighboring house, which he said was a change house, that is a public house, and take a cup of ale with him. This they consented to, seeing Mr. Fay was alone, so they went all with him. In the meantime, Mr. Fay found means to give secret orders that the oars, masts, and sails of the pirate's boat should be all carried away, and that a quarter of an hour after they had sat together, he should be called hastily out of the room on some pretense or other of somebody to speak with him, all which was performed to a tittle. When he was got from them, he gave orders that his 6 men, who before he had got together, and who were now come to him well armed, should place themselves at a certain stile behind a thick hedge, and which was about halfway between the alehouse and his own house, saying that if he came that way with the boatswain alone, they should suddenly start out upon them both, and throwing him down, should seize upon the other, but that if all the 5 came with him, he would take an occasion to be either before or behind them, so that they might all fire upon them without danger of hurting him. Having given these orders, and depending upon their being well executed, he returned to the company, and having given them more ale, told them he would gladly do them any service that he could lawfully do, and that if they would take the trouble of walking up to his house in a peaceable manner, so that his family might not be frighted with seeing him among them, they should have all the assistance that was in his power. The fellows, whether they had taken too much ale, or whether the condition of their ship and the hopes of getting a boat to help them blinded their eyes, is not certain, fell with ease into this snare, and agreed readily to go along with Mr. Fay, but after a while resolved not to go all of them, only deputed the boatswain to go, which was what Mr. Fay most desired. The boatswain was very willing to accept of the trust, but it was observed he took a great deal of care of his arms, which were no less than 4 pistols, all loaded with a brace of bullets each. Nor would he be persuaded to leave any of them behind him, no, not with his own men. In this posture Mr. Fay and the boatswain walked along together very quietly until they came to the stile, having got over which Mr. Fay, seeing his men all ready, turned short about upon the boatswain, and taking him by the collar, told him he was his prisoner, and the same moment the rest of his men rushing in upon them, threw both down, and so secured the boatswain, without giving him time so much as to fire 1 pistol. He cried out, indeed, with all his might to alarm his men, but they soon stopped his mouth by first forcing a pistol into it, and then a handkerchief, and having disarmed him, bound his hands behind him and his feet together. Then Mr. Fay left him there under a guard, and with his other 5 men, but without arms, at least such that could be seen, returned to the alehouse to the rest. The house having 2 doors, they divided themselves, and rushing in at both doors at the same time, they seized the 4 men before they were aware, or had time to lay hold of their arms. They did indeed what men could do, and one of them snapped a pistol at Mr. Fay, but it did not go off, and Mr. Fay, at the same time snatching at the pistol, to divert the shot if it had fired, struck his hand with such force against the cock as very much bruised it. They were all 5 now in his power, and he sent them away under a good guard to a village in the middle of the island, where they were kept separate from one another, and sufficiently secured. Mr. Fay then dispatched expresses to the gentlemen in the neighboring island to acquaint them with what he had done, and to desire their speedy assistance, also desiring earnestly that they would take care that no boat should go within reach of the pirates' guns. And at night Mr. Fay caused fires to be made upon the hills round him, to alarm the country, and ordered all the boats round the island to be hauled up upon the beach, as far as it was possible, and disabled also, lest the pirates should swim from the ship and get any of them into their possession. Next day, the 4th, it blew very hard all day, and in the evening about high water it shifted to west-northwest, upon which the pirates set their sails, expecting to get off, and so to lay it round the island and put out to sea. But the fellow who was ordered to cut the cable, missing several strokes, the cable checked the ship's way, and consequently on a sudden she took all aback. Then the cable being parted when it should have been held, the ship ran directly on shore on the Calf Island, nor could all their speed prevent it. With an air of desperation, Gow told them they were all dead men, nor could it indeed be otherwise, for having lost the only boat they had, and 5 of their best hands, they were able to do little or nothing towards getting their ship off. Besides, as she went on shore at the top of high water and a spring tide, there was no hope of getting her off afterward. Wherefore, the next morning, being Monday the 15th, they hung out a white flag, as a signal for a parley, and sent a man on shore upon Calf Island, for now they could go on shore out of the ship at half flood. Now Mr. Fay thought he might talk with Gow in a different style from what he did before. So he wrote a letter to him, wherein he complained of the rude behavior of his 5 men, for which he told him he had been obliged to seize on them and make them prisoners, letting him know that the country being all alarmed would soon be too many for him, and therefore advised him to surrender himself peaceably, and be the author of a quiet surrender of the rest, as the only means to obtain any favor. and then he might become an evidence against the rest, and so might save his own life. This letter Mr. Fay sent by a boat with 4 armed men to the island, to be given to the fellow that Gow had sent on shore, and who waited there. At the same time he gave them a letter from Gow to Mr. Fay, for now he was humbled enough to write, which before he refused. Gow's letter to Mr. Fay was to let him have some men and boats to take out the best of the cargo in order to lighten the ship and set her afloat, offering himself to come on shore and be hostage for the security of men and boats, and to give Mr. Fay £1,000 in goods for the service. He declared at the same time that if this small succor was refused him, he would take care nobody should better himself by his misfortunes, for rather than they would suffer themselves to be taken, they would set fire to the ship and would all perish together. Mr. Fay replied to this letter that he had a boat indeed, that would have been fit for his service, but that she was staved and sunk. But if he would come on shore quietly without arms, and bring his carpenter with him to repair the boat, he might have her. Mr. Fay did this to give Gow an opportunity to embrace his first offer of surrendering. But Gow was neither humble enough to come in, nor sincere enough to treat with him fairly, if he had intended to let him have the boat. And if he had, it is probable that the former letter had made the men suspicious of him, so that now he could do nothing without communicating it to the rest of the crew. About 4 in the afternoon, Mr. Fay received an answer to his last letter, the copy of which is exactly as follows. From on board our ship, the Revenge, February 16th, 1725. Honored Sir, I am sorry to hear of the irregular proceedings of my men. I gave no orders to that effect, and what hath been wrongfully done to the country was contrary to my inclinations. It is my misfortune to be in this condition at present. It was in your power to have done otherwise in making my fortune better. Since my being in the country, I have wronged no man, nor taken anything but what I have paid for. My design in coming was to make the country better, which I am still capable to do, providing you are just to me. I thank you for the concern you have for my bad fortune, and am sorry I cannot embrace your proposal as to being evidence. My people have already made use of that advantage. I have by my last signified my design of proceeding, provided I can procure no better terms. Please to send James Lang on board to continue till my return. I should be glad to have the good fortune to commune with you upon that subject. I beg that you would assist me with the boat, and be assured I do no man harm were it in my power, as I am now at your mercy. I cannot surrender myself prisoner. I'd rather commit myself to the mercy of the seas, so that if you will incline to contribute to my escape, I shall leave my ship and cargo at your disposal. I continue, Honored Sir, etc., John Smith. Upon this letter, and especially that part wherein Gow desired to commune with him, Mr. Fay, believing he might do some service in persuading him to submit, went over to Calf Island, and went on shore alone, ordering his boat to lie in readiness to take him in again, but not one man to stir out of her, and calling to Gow with a speaking trumpet, desired him to come on shore. This the other readily did, but Mr. Fay, before he ventured, wisely foresaw that whilst he was alone upon the island, the pirates might, unknown from him, get the ship by different ways, and under cover of shore might get behind and surround him. To prevent which, he set a man upon the top of his own house, which was on the opposite shore, and overlooked the whole island, and ordered him to make signals with his flag, waving his flag once for every man that he saw come on shore. But if 4 or more came on shore, then to keep the flag waving continually, till he, Mr. Fay, should retire. This precaution was very needful, for no sooner was Mr. Fay advanced upon the island, expecting Gow to come on shore to meet him, but he saw a fellow come from the ship, with a white flag, a bottle, a glass, and a bundle. Then turning to his own house, he saw his man make the signals appointed, and that the man kept the flag continually waving, upon which he immediately retired to his boat. And he was no sooner got into it, but he saw 5 fellows running under shore, with lighted matches and grenadoes in their hands, to have intercepted him, but seeing him out of their reach, they retired to the ship. After this, the fellow with the white flag came up and gave Mr. Fay 2 letters. He would have left the bundle, which he said was a present to Mr. Fay, and the bottle, which he said was a bottle of brandy, but Mr. Fay would not take them, but told the fellow his captain was a treacherous villain, and he did not doubt that he should see him hanged, and as to him, the fellow, he had a great mind to shoot him, upon which the fellow took to his heels, and Mr. Fay, being in his boat, did not think it worth while to land again to pursue him. This put an end to all parley for the present, but had the pirates succeeded in this attempt, they would have so far gained their point, either that they must have been assisted, or Mr. Fay must have been sacrificed. The 2 letters from Gow were one for Mr. Fay, and the other for his wife. The first was much to the same purpose as the former, only that in this Gow requested the great boat with her masts, sails, and oars, with some provisions to transport themselves whither they thought fit to go for their own safety, offering to leave the ship and cargo to Mr. Fay, and threatening that if the men of war arrived, for Mr. Fay had given him notice that he expected 2 men of war before he was thus assisted, they would set fire to the ship and blow themselves up, so that as they had lived, so they would die together. The letter to Mrs. Fay was to desire her to intercede with her husband and plead that he was their countryman and had been her husband's schoolfellow, etc., but no answer was returned to either of these letters. On the 17th, in the morning, contrary to expectation, Gow himself came on shore upon the Calf Island. According to Johnson's History of the Pirates, Chapter 18, Gow's real motive for returning to the Orkneys was to wed a girl whose parents had repulsed him on account of his poverty. She was the daughter of one Mr. G., a well-to-do man. Unarmed, except for his sword, and alone, only one man at a distance, carrying a white flag making signals for a parley, Mr. Fay, who by this time had gotten more people about him, immediately sent one, Mr. Fay of Whitehall, a gentleman of his own family, with 5 other persons well armed over the island, with orders to secure Gow, if it were possible, by any means, either dead or alive. When they came on shore, Gow proposed that one of them, whose name was Shottery, a master of a vessel, should go on board the ship as hostage for this Gow's safety, and Shottery consenting, Gow himself conducted him to the ship's side. Mr. Fay, perceiving this from his own house, immediately took another boat and went over to the island himself, and while he was expostulating with his men for letting Shottery go for hostage, Gow returned, and Mr. Fay made no hesitation, but told him that he was his prisoner. At this, Gow started and said that it ought not to be so, since there was a hostage delivered for him. Mr. Fay said he gave no order for it, and it was what they could not justify, and since Shottery had ventured without orders, he must take his fate. He would run the venture of it. But he advised Gow, as he expected good usage himself, that he would send the fellow who carried his white flag back to the ship with orders for them to return Shottery in safety, and to desire Winter and Peterson to come with him. Gow declined giving any such orders, but the fellow said he would readily go and fetch them, and did so, and they came along with him. When Gow saw them, he reproached them for being so easily imposed on, and ordered them to go back to the ship immediately. But Mr. Fay's men, who were too strong for them, surrounded them and took them all. When this was done, they demanded Gow to deliver his sword, but he said he would rather die with it in his hand, and begged them to shoot him, but was denied. And Mr. Fay's men, disarming him of his sword, carried him with the other 2 into their boat, and after that to the main island where Mr. Fay lived. Having thus secured the captain, Mr. Fay prevailed with him to go to the shore over against the ship, and to call the gunner and another man to come on shore on Calf Island, which they did. But they were no sooner there, but they also were surrounded by some men which Mr. Fay had placed out of sight upon the island for that purpose. Then they made Gow call to the carpenter to come on shore, still making them believe they would have a boat. And Mr. Fay went over and met him alone, and talking with him, told him they could not repair the boat without help and without tools. So, persuading him to go back and bring a hand or two with him, and some tools, some oakum, nails, etc., the carpenter, being thus deluded, went back and brought a Frenchman and another with him, with all things proper for their work, all of whom, as soon as they came on shore, were likewise seized and secured by Mr. Fay and his men. But there were still a great many men in the ship, whom it was necessary to bring, if possible, to a quiet surrender. So Mr. Fay ordered his men to make a feint as if they would go to work upon the great boat which lay on the shore upon the island, but in sight of the ship. There they hammered and knocked and made a noise as if they were really caulking and repairing her, in order to her being launched off and put into their possession. But towards night he obliged Gow to write to the men that Mr. Fay would not deliver the boat until he was in possession of the ship, and therefore he ordered them all to come on shore without arms and in a peaceable manner. This occasioned many debates in the ship, but as they had no officers to guide them and were all in confusion, they knew not what to do. So after some time, bewailing their hard fate and dividing what money was left in the ship among them, they yielded and went on shore, and were all made prisoners, to the number of 28, including those who were secured before. Being now all secured and in custody in the most proper places in the island, Mr. Fay took care to give notice to the proper officers in the country, and by them to the government of Edinburgh, in order to get help for the carrying them to England. The distance being so great, it took up some time, for the government at Edinburgh not being immediately concerned in it, but rather the Court of Admiralty of Great Britain, expresses were dispatched from thence to London, that His Majesty's pleasure might be known, in return to which orders were dispatched into Scotland to have them immediately sent up into England with as much expedition as the case would admit. Accordingly, they were brought up by land to Edinburgh first, and from thence, being put on board the Greyhound frigate, they were brought by sea to England. This necessarily took up a great deal of time, so that they had been wise enough to improve the hours that were left. They had almost half a year's time to prepare themselves for death, though they cruelly denied the poor mate of a few moments to commend his soul to God's mercy, even after he was half murdered before. They were most of them in custody the latter end of January, and were not executed till the 11th of June. The Greyhound arrived in the river the 25th of March, and the next day came to an anchor at Woolwich, and the pirates, being put into boats appointed to receive them, with a strong guard to attend them, were brought on shore on the 30th, and conveyed to the Marshalsea prison in Southwark, where they were delivered to the keepers of the said prison, and were laid in irons. There they had the mortification to meet Lieutenant Williams, who was brought home by the Argyle man-of-war from Lisbon, and had been committed to the same prison but a very few days before. Indeed, as it was a mortification to them, so it was more to him, for though he might be secretly pleased that those who had so cruelly, as he called it, put him into the hands of justice by sending him to Lisbon, were brought into the same circumstances with himself, yet, on the other hand, it could not but be a terrible mortification to him that here were now sufficient witnesses found to prove his crimes against him, which were not so easy to be had before. Being thus laid fast, it remained to proceed against them in due form, and this took up some long time still. On Friday, the 2nd of April, they were all carried to Doctors' Commons, where the proper judges being present, they were examined, by which examination the measures were taken for the farther proceedings. For as they were not equally guilty, so it was needful to determine who it was proper to bring to an immediate trial, and who, being less guilty, were more proper objects of the government's clemency, as being under force and fear, and consequently necessitated to act as they did, and also who it might be proper to single out as an evidence against the rest. After being thus examined, they were remanded to the Marshalsea. On Saturday, the 8th of May, the 5 who were appointed for evidence against the rest, and whose names are particularly set down in its place, were sent from the Marshalsea prison to Newgate, in order to give their information. Being thus brought up to London, and committed to the Marshalsea prison, and the government being fully informed what black uncommon offenders they were, it was thought proper to bring them to speedy justice. In order to this, some of them, as has been said, who were less criminal than the rest, and who apparently had been forced into their service, were sorted out, and being examined, given first an account of themselves, and then of the whole fraternity. It was thought fit to make use of their evidence for the more clear detecting and convincing of the rest. These were George Dobson, John Finney's, Timothy Murphy, and William Booth. They were the principal evidences, and were indeed more than sufficient, for they so exactly agreed in their evidence, and the prisoners, pirates, said so little in their defense, that there was no room for the jury to question their guilt, or to doubt the truth of any part of the account given in. Robert Reed was a young man mentioned before, who escaped from the boat in the Orkneys, where he surrendered himself after getting a horse at a farmer's house, and conveying himself to Kirkwall, the chief town of the said Orkneys. Nevertheless, he was brought up as a prisoner with the rest, nor was he made use of as an evidence, but was tried upon most, if not all, the indictments with the rest. But Dobson, one of the witnesses, did him the justice to testify that he was forced into their service, as others were, for fear of having their throats cut, as many had been served before their faces, and that in particular he was not present at or concerned in any of the murders for which the rest were indicted. Upon which evidence he was acquitted by the jury. Also he brought one Archibald Suter, the man of the house said before to be a farmhouse, as to whether the said Reed made his escape in the Orkneys, who testified that he did so escape to him, and that he begged him to procure him a horse to ride off to Kirkwall, which he did, and there he surrendered himself. Also he testified that Reed gave him, Suter, a full account of the ship and the pirates that were in her, and what they were, and that he, Suter, revealed it all to the collector of the customs, by which means the country was alarmed. And he added that it was by this man's means that all the prisoners were apprehended, though that was going too far, for 'tis plain that it was by the vigilance and courage of Mr. Fay chiefly, that they were reduced to such distresses as obliged them to surrender. However, it was true that Reed's escape did alarm the country, and that he merited very well of the public for the timely discovery he made. So he came off clear, as indeed it was but just. For he was not only forced to serve them, but as Dobson testified for him, he had often expressed his uneasiness at being obliged to act with them, and that he wished he could get away. And he was sincere in those wishes, as appeared by his taking the first opportunity he could get to put it in practice. This Dobson was one of the 10 men who ran away with the pirates' longboat from the Orkneys, and who were afterwards made prisoners in the Firth of Leith, and carried up to Edinburgh. Gow was now a prisoner among the rest in the Marshalsea. His behavior there was sullen and reserved, rather than penitent. It had been hinted to him by Mr. Fay, as by others, that by his behavior he should endeavor to make himself an evidence against others, and to merit his life by a ready submission, and obliging others to do the like. But Gow was no fool, and he easily saw there were too many gone before who had provided for their own safety at his expense. And besides that, he knew himself too deeply guilty of cruelty and murder to be accepted by public justice as an evidence, especially where so many other less criminals were to be had. This made him, with good reason too, give over any thoughts of escaping by such means as that, and perhaps, seeing so plainly that there was no room for it, might be the reason why he seemed to reject the offer. Otherwise he was not a person of such nice honor as that we should suppose he would not have secured his own life at the expense of his comrades. Gow appeared to have given over all thoughts of life from the first time he came to England. Not that he showed any tokens of his repentance, or any sense of his condition suitable to that which was before him, but continuing sullen and reserved, even to the very time he was brought to the bar. When he came there, he could not be tried with the rest, for the arraignment being made in the usual form, he refused to plead. The court used all the arguments which humanity dictates in such cases. One of these humane arguments, according to Johnson, op. cit., consisted in tying his thumbs together with whipcord, which was done several times by the executioner and another officer, they drawing the cord until it broke. to prevail on him to come into ordinary course of other people in like government, laying before him the sentence of the law in such cases, namely, that he must be pressed to death, the only torturing execution which, however, they were obliged to inflict. But he continued inflexible, carried on his obstinacy to such a height as to receive the sentence in form, as usual in such cases. The execution being appointed to be done the next morning, he was carried back to Newgate in order to it. But whether he was prevailed with by argument and the reasons of those about him, or whether the apparatus for the execution and the manner of the death he was to die terrified him, we cannot say. But the next morning he yielded, and petitioned to be allowed to plead, and he admitted to be tried in the ordinary way, which being granted, he was brought to the bar by himself and pleaded, being arraigned again upon the same indictment upon which he had been sentenced as a mute, and was found guilty. Williams the lieutenant, who was put on board the Bristol ship, as hath been said, with orders to deliver him on board the first English man of war they should meet with, comes, of course, to have the rest of his history made up in this place. The captain of the Bristol ship, though he received his orders from the crew of pirates and rogues, whose instructions he was not obliged to follow, and whose accusation of Williams they were not obliged to give credit to, yet punctually obeyed the order, and put him on board the Argyle, Captain Bowler then lying in the port of Lisbon and bound for England, who, as they took him in irons, kept him so, and brought him to England in the same conditions. But as the pirates did not send any of their company, nor indeed could they do it, along with him to be evidence against him, and the men who went out of the pirate ship on board the Bristol ship, being till then kept as prisoners on board the pirate ship, and perhaps could not have said enough, or given particular evidence sufficient to convict him in a course of justice, Providence supplied the want by bringing the whole crew to the same place, for Williams was in the Marshalsea prison before them, and by that means they furnished sufficient evidence against Williams also, so that they were all tried together. In Williams' case, the evidence was as particular as in Gow's, and Dobson and the others swore positively that Williams boasted that after Macaulay had cut the supercargo's throat imperfectly, he, Williams, murdered him, and added that he would not give him time to say his prayers, but shot him through the head. Finney's and Timothy Murphy testified the same, and to show the bloody disposition of this wretch, William Booth testified that Williams proposed afterwards to the company that if they took any more ships, they should not encumber themselves with the men, having already so many prisoners that in case of a fight they should not be safe with them, but that they should take them and tie them back to back and throw them all overboard into the sea. It should not be omitted here also in the case of Gow himself, as I have observed in the introduction, that Gow had long meditated the kind of villainy which he now put in practice, and that it was his resolution to turn pirate the first opportunity he should get, whatever voyage he undertook, and that I observed he had intended it on board a ship in which he came home from Lisbon, and failed only for want of a sufficient party. So this resolution of his is confirmed by the testimony and confession of James Belvin, one of his fellow criminals, who upon trial declared that he knew that Gow and the crew of the George Galley had a design to turn pirates from the beginning, and added that he discovered it to George Dobson in Amsterdam before the ship went out to sea. For the confirmation of this, George Dobson was called up again, after he had given his evidence upon the trials, and being confronted by Belvin, he did acknowledge that Belvin had said so, and that in particular he had said that the boatswain had a design to murder the master and some others and run away with the ship. Being asked why he did not immediately reveal it to the master, Captain Farragut, he answered that he heard Belvin tell the mate of it, and that the mate told the captain, but the captain made light of it. But the boatswain, finding himself discovered, refused to go, upon which Gow was made second mate, and Belvin was made boatswain, and he had been as honest afterwards as before, whereas, on the contrary, he was as forward and active as any of them, except that he was not in the first secret, nor in the murders. He might have escaped what afterwards became so justly his due. But as they acted together, justice required that they should suffer together, and accordingly Gow and Williams, Belvin, Melvin, Winter, Peterson, Rowlandson and Macaulay, received the reward of their cruelty and blood at the gallows, being all executed together on the 11th of June. It happened that Gow, being a very strong man, and giving a kind of spring, it so strained the rope that on some people pulling him by the legs, it broke and he fell down, after he had remained about 4 minutes suspended. His fall stunned him a little, but as soon as he was taken up, he recovered himself so far as to be able to ascend the ladder a second time, which he did with very little concern, dying with the same brutal ferocity which animated all his actions while alive. His body hangs in chains over against Greenwich, as that of Williams does over against Blackwall. End of the history of the life and surprising adventures of John Gow, alias Smith, a most notorious pirate and murderer. Recording by Lauren Randall.
Chapter 42 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3 by Arthur L. Hayward. Chapter 42. A true and perfect account of the examination, confession, trial, condemnation, and execution of John Perry, his mother and brother, for the supposed murder of William Harrison, gentleman. Appendix. Although the several histories which are related within the compass of this appendix do not so properly fall under the general title of this work, most of them having fallen out in a period of time long before that to which I have fixed the beginning of these memoirs of the unfortunate victims to public justice. Yet there are two reasons which determined me to give these narratives a place in this collection. The first is that the wonders of Providence signalized in these transactions might hereby be recorded and preserved to posterity, and that the other, from the perusal the wicked might be deterred from pursuing their vicious courses, from the prospect of those sudden, dreadful, and unexpected strokes which the best hid criminal practices have met with from the unsearchable conduct of divine justice. And as these arguments had weight enough with me to engage me to the performance of this work, so I hope that they will also incline my readers to peruse them with that improvement and delight which I have ever aimed to excite in the course of my labors. A true and perfect account of the examination, confession, trial, condemnation, and execution of John Perry, his mother and brother, for the supposed murder of William Harrison, gentleman. Upon Thursday, the 6th of August, 1660, William Harrison, steward to the Lady Viscount Camden, at Camden in Gloucester, being about 70 years of age, walked from Camden aforesaid to Sharingworth, about 2 miles from thence, to receive his lady's rent, and not returning so early as formerly, his wife, Mrs. Harrison, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, sent her servant John Perry to meet his master on the way from Sharingworth. But neither Mr. Harrison nor his servant John Perry returning that night, early the next morning, Edward Harrison, William's son, went towards Charingworth to inquire after his father. On the way he met Perry coming thence, and being informed by him that he was not there, they went together to Ebrington, a village between Sharingworth and Camden, where they were told by one Daniel that Mr. Harrison called at his house the evening before in his return from Charingworth, but stayed not. Then they went to Paxford, about half a mile from thence, where, hearing nothing of Mr. Harrison, they returned towards Campden, and on the way hearing of a hat, band, and a comb taken up on the highway between Ebington and Camden by a poor woman then gleaning in the field, they sought her out. With her they found the hat, band, and comb, which they knew to be Mr. Harrison's, and being brought by the woman to the place where she found the same, in the highway between Ebrington and Camden. Near unto a great furze brake, they there searched for Mr. Harrison, supposing he had been murdered, the hat and the comb being hacked and cut, and the band bloody, but nothing more could there be found. The news hereof coming to Camden so alarmed the town that the men, women, and children hasted thence in multitudes to search for Mr. Harrison's supposed dead body, but all in vain. Mrs. Harrison's fears for her husband were now much increased, and having sent her servant Perry the evening before to meet his master, and he not returning that night, caused a suspicion that he had robbed and murdered him. Thereupon the said Perry was the next day brought before a justice of the peace, by whom being examined concerning his master's absence, and his own staying out the night he went to meet him, gave this account of himself, that his mistress sending him to meet his master, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, he went down Campden Field towards Charingworth, about a land's length, where meeting one William Reed of Camden, he acquainted him with his errand, and farther told him that, as it was growing dark, he was afraid to go forwards, and would therefore return and fetch his young master's horse, and return with him. He went to Mr. Harrison's court gate, where they parted. He stayed till one Pierce, coming by, he went again with him about a bow shot into the fields, and returned with him likewise to his master's gate, where they also parted. And the said John Perry averred that he went into his master's hen roost, where he lay about an hour, but slept not, but when the clock struck 12, arose and went towards Charingworth, until a great mist arising, he lost his way, and so lay the rest of the night under a hedge. At break of day on Friday morning he went to Charingworth, where he inquired for his master of one Edward Plaisterer, who told him he had been with him the afternoon before, and received 23 pounds of him, but stayed not long with him. He went to William Curtis of the same town, who told him he heard his master was at his house the day before, but being not at home, did not see him. After which he said he returned homewards, it being about 5 o'clock in the morning, when on the way he met his master's son, with whom he went to Ebrington and Paxford, etc. Curtis, being examined, affirmed what Perry had said concerning them to be true. Perry, then being asked by the justice of peace how he, who was afraid to go to Charingworth at 9 o'clock, became so bold as to go thither at 12, answered that at 9 o'clock it was dark, but at 12 the moon shone. Being further asked why, returning twice home after his mistress had sent him to meet his master, and staying until 12 of the clock, he went not into the house to know whether his master was come, before he went a third time, at that time of night, to look after him. He answered that he knew his master was not at home, because he saw a light in his chamber window, which never used to be there so late when he was at home. Yet notwithstanding this, that Perry had said about staying forth that night, it was not thought fit to discharge him until further inquiry was made after Mr. Harrison, and accordingly he continued in custody at Camden, sometimes in an inn there, and sometimes in the common prison, from Saturday, August the 18th, to the Friday following, during which time he was again examined at Camden by the aforesaid justice of peace, but confessed nothing more than before, nor at that time could any further discovery be made as to what was become of Mr. Harrison. But it hath been said that during his restraint at Camden he told some, who pressed him to confess what he knew concerning his master, that a tinker had killed him, and to others he said that a gentleman's servant of the neighbourhood had robbed and murdered him. And others again he told that he was murdered and hid in a bean-rick in Camden, where search was in vain made for him. At length he gave out that if he was again carried before the justice, he would discover that to him which he would not do to anybody else. And thereupon he was on Friday, August the 24th, again brought before the justice of peace, who first examined him, and asking him whether he would confess what had become of his master, he answered he was murdered, but not by him. The justice of peace then telling him that if he knew him to be murdered, he knew likewise by whom he was. So he acknowledged he did, and being urged to confess what he knew concerning it, affirmed that it was his mother and brother that had murdered his master. The justice of peace then advised him to consider what he said, telling him that he feared he might be guilty of his master's death, and that he should not draw more innocent blood upon his head, for what he now charged his mother and brother with might cost them their lives. But he, affirming he spoke nothing but the truth, and that if he were immediately to die he would justify it, the justice desired him to declare how and when they did it. He then told him that ever since he came into his master's service, his mother and brother had lain at him to help them to money, telling him how poor they were, and that it was in his power to relieve them by giving them notice when his master went to receive his lady's rents, for they would then waylay him and rob him. And further he said that upon the Thursday morning, when his master went to Charingworth, going on an errand into town, he met his brother in the street, whom he then told whither his master was going, and if he waylaid him he might have his money. And further said that in the evening, when his mistress sent him to meet his master, he met his brother in the street before his master's gate, going, as he said, to meet his master. And so they went together to the churchyard, about a stone's throw from Mr. Harrison's gate, where they parted. He going the footway beyond the church, they met again, and so went together the way leading to Charingworth, until they came to a gate about a bowshot from Camden Church, that goes into a ground of the Lady Camden's, called the Conygree, which, to those who have a key to go through the garden, is the nearest from that place to Mrs. Harrison's house. When they came near unto that gate, he, the said John Perry, said he told his brother that he believed his master was just gone into the Conygree, for it was then so dark they could not discern any man so as to know him. But perceiving there was no way but for those who had a key through the gardens, he concluded it was his master who had gone through, and so told his brother if he followed him he might have his money, and he in the meantime would walk a turn in the fields, which accordingly he did, and then followed his brother. About the middle of the Conygree he found his master on the ground, his brother upon him, and his mother standing by. Being asked whether his master was dead, he answered no, for that after he came to them, his master cried, "Oh, rogues, will you kill me?" At which he told his brother he hoped he would not kill his master. His brother replied, "Peace, peace, you're a fool," and so strangled him. Which having done, he took a bag of money out of his pocket, and threw it into his mother's lap, and then he and his brother carried his master's dead body into the garden, adjoining to the Conygree, where they consulted what to do with it, and at length agreed to throw it into the great pool by Wallington's mill behind the garden. His mother and brother bid him go up to the court next to the house, to hearken whether anyone was stirring, and they would throw the body into the pool. And being asked whether it was there, he said he knew not, for that he left it in the garden. But his mother and brother said they would throw it there, and if it was not there, he knew not where it was, for that he returned no more to them, but went into the court gate, which goes into the town. He met with John Pierce, with whom he went into the field, and again returned with him to his master's gate, after which he went into the hen roost, where he lay until 12 o'clock at night, but slept not, and having, when he came from his mother and brother, brought with him his master's hat, band, and comb, which he laid in the hen roost, he carried the said hat, band, and comb, and threw them, after he had given them 3 or 4 cuts with his knife, in the highway, where they were found afterwards. After being asked what he intended by so doing, he said he did it that it might be believed his master had been there robbed and murdered, and having thus disposed of his hat, band, and comb, he went towards Charingworth, as hath been related. Upon this confession and accusation, the justice of peace gave order for the apprehending of Joan and Richard Perry, the mother and brother of John Perry, and for searching the pool where Mr. Harrison's body was said to be thrown, which was accordingly done, but nothing of him could be found there. The fish pools likewise in Campden were drawn and searched, but nothing could be found there either, so that some were of the opinion that the body might be laid in the ruins of Camden House, burnt in the late wars, and not unfit for such a concealment, where was likewise search made, but all in vain. On Saturday, August 25th, Joan and Richard Perry, together with John Perry, were brought before the Justice of Peace, who acquainted the said Joan and Richard with what John had lain to their charge. They denied all, with many imprecations on themselves if they were at the least guilty of anything of which they were accused. But John, on the other side, affirmed to their faces that he had spoken nothing but the truth, and that they had murdered his master, further telling them that he could never be at quiet for them, since he came into his master's service, being continually followed by them to help them to money, which they told him he might do by giving them notice when his master went to receive his lady's rents, and that meeting his brother Richard in Camden Town, the Thursday morning his master went to Charingworth, he told him whither he was going, and upon what errand. Richard confessed he met his brother that morning and spoke with him, but nothing passed between them to that purpose. Both he and his mother told John he was a villain to accuse them wrongfully, as he had done, but John on the other side affirmed that he had spoken nothing but the truth, and would justify it to his death. One remarkable circumstance happened in these prisoners' return from the Justice's house to Camden, viz. Richard Perry, following a good distance behind his brother John, pulling a clout out of his pocket, dropped a ball of inkle, which one of his guards, taking up, he desired him to restore it, saying it was only his wife's hair lace. But the party, opening it, and finding a slip knot at the end, went and showed it unto John, who was then a good distance before, and knew nothing of the dropping and taking up of this inkle. Being showed it, and asked whether he knew it, he shook his head and said yes, to his sorrow, for that was the string his brother strangled his master with. This was sworn upon the evidence at their trial. The morrow being the Lord's Day, they remained at Camden, where the minister of the place, designing to speak to them, if possible, to persuade them to repentance and a farther confession, they were brought to church, and in their way thither, passing by Richard's house, two of his children meeting him, he took the lesser in his arm, and was leading the other in his hand, when on a sudden both their noses fell a-bleeding, which was looked upon as ominous. Here it will be no impertinent digression to tell how the year before Mr. Harrison had his house broken open between 11 and 12 o'clock at noon, upon Camden market day, whilst himself and his whole family were away, a ladder being set up to a window of the second story, and an iron bar wrenched thence with a ploughshare, which was left in the room, and 70 pounds in money carried away, the authors of which robbery could never be found. After this, and not many weeks before Mr. Harrison's absence, one evening in Captain Garden his servant Perry made a hideous outcry, whereas some who heard it coming in met him running and seemingly affrighted, with a sheep-pick in his hand, to whom he told a story how he had been set upon by 2 men in white with naked swords, and how he defended himself with his sheep-pick, the handle whereof was cut in 2 or 3 places, as was likewise a key in his pocket, which he said was done with one of their swords. The passages the Justice of the Peace having before heard, and calling to mind upon Perry's confession, asked him first concerning the robbery, when his master lost 70 pounds out of his house at noonday, whether he knew who did it. He answered, yes, it was his brother, and being further asked whether it was with him, he answered no, he was at church, but that he gave him notice of the money, and told him in which room it was, and where he might have a ladder that would reach the window, and that his brother after told him he had the money and had buried it in his garden, and that they were at Michaelmas next to have divided it. Whereupon search was made in the garden, but no money could be there found. And being further asked concerning the other passage, of his being assaulted in the garden, he confessed it was all a fiction, and that he did it having a design to rob his master, so that rogues being believed to haunt the place, when his master was robbed they might be thought to have done it. At the next assizes, which were held in September following, John, Joan, and Richard Perry had 2 indictments found against them, one for breaking into William Harrison's house and robbing him of £140 in the year 1659, the other for robbing and murdering the said William Harrison on the 16th day of August 1660. Upon the last indictment, the Judge of the Assizes, Sir C.T., would not try them, because the body was not found, but they were then tried upon the other indictment for robbery, to which they pleaded not guilty. But someone whispering behind them, they soon pleaded guilty, humbly begging the benefit of His Majesty's gracious pardon and the Act of Oblivion, which was granted them. But then they pleaded guilty to their indictment, being thereunto promised as probable by some who were unwilling to lose time and trouble the court with their trial, as the Act of Oblivion pardoned them. Yet they all afterwards, and at their death, denied that they were guilty of that robbery, or that they knew who did it. Yet at his assize, as several credible persons have affirmed, John Perry still persisted in his story that his mother and brother had murdered his master, and further added that they had attempted to poison him in gaol, so that he durst neither eat nor drink with them. At the next assizes, which was held the spring following, John, Joan, and Richard Perry were, by the then Judge of Assize, Sir B.H., tried upon the indictment of murder, and pleaded thereunto severally not guilty. And when John's confession before the justice was proved viva voce by several witnesses who heard the same, he told them he was then mad and knew not what he said. The other 2, Richard and Joan Perry, said they were wholly innocent of what they were accused, and that they knew nothing of Mr. Harrison's death, nor what was become of him. And Richard said that his brother had accused others as well as him of having murdered his master, which the judge bidding him prove, he said that most of those who had given evidence against him knew it, but naming none, nor did any speak to it. And so the jury found them all 3 guilty. Some few days after being brought to the place of their execution, which was on Broadway Hill, in sight of Camden, the mother, who was reputed a witch and to have bewitched her sons so that they would confess nothing while she lived, was executed first. After which Richard, being upon the ladder, professed as he had done all along that he was wholly innocent of the fact for which he was then to die, and that he knew nothing of Mr. Harrison's death, nor what was become of him, and did with great earnestness beg and beseech his brother, for the satisfaction of the whole world, and for his own conscience, to declare what he knew concerning him. But he, with a dogged and surly carriage, told the people he was not obliged to confess to them. Yet immediately before his death he said he knew nothing of his master's death, nor what had become of him, but they might hereafter possibly hear. Mr. Harrison's account of his being absent 2 years, and of his return home, addressed to Sir Thomas Overbury, Knight. Honoured Sir, in obedience to your commands, I give you this true account of my being carried away beyond the seas, my continuance there, and return home. On Thursday in the afternoon, in the time of harvest, I went to Charingworth to demand rents due to my Lady Campden, at which the tenants were busy in the fields, and were late ere they came home, which occasioned my stay there till the close of the evening. I expected a considerable sum, but received only £23 and no more. In my return home, in the narrow passages amongst Ebrington furzes, there met me one horseman, and said, "Art thou there?" And I, fearing that he would have rode over me, struck his horse over the nose, whereupon he struck me with his sword several blows, and ran it into my side, while I with my little cane made my defence as well as I could. At last another came behind me, ran me in the thigh, laid hold on the collar of my doublet, and drew me to a hedge near to the place. Then came in another. They did not take away my money, but mounted me behind one of them, drew my arms about his middle, and fastened my wrists together with something that had a spring lock to it, as I conceived, by hearing it give a snap as they put it on. Then they threw a great cloak over me, and carried me away. In the night they alighted at a hayrick, which stood near unto a stone pit by a wall side, where they took away my money. This was about 2 hours before day, and I heard one of them tell the other he thought it had to be then. They tumbled me into the stone pit. They stayed, as I thought, about an hour at the hayrick. When they took horse again, one of them bade me come out of the pit. I answered that they had my money already, and asked what they would do with me. Whereupon he struck me again, drew me out, and put a great quantity of money into my pockets, and mounted me again after the same manner. And on Friday, after sunset, they brought me to a lone house upon a heath by a thicket of bushes, where they took me down, almost dead, being sorely bruised with the carriage of the money. When the woman of the house saw that I could neither stand nor speak, she asked them whether or no they had brought a dead man. They answered no, but a friend that was hurt, and they were carrying me to a surgeon. She answered, if they did not make haste, their friend would be dead before they could bring him to one. There they laid me on the cushions, and suffered none to come into the room but a little girl. There we stayed all night, they giving me some broth and strong waters. In the morning very early they mounted me as before, and on Saturday night they brought me to a place where were 2 or 3 houses, in one of which I lay all night on cushions by their bedside. On Sunday morning they carried me from thence, and about 3 or 4 of the clock they brought me to a place by the seaside, called Deal, where they laid me down in the ground. One of them staying by me, the other 2 walked a little off to meet a man, with whom they talked, and in their discourse I heard them mention £7, after which they went away together, and about half an hour after returned. The man, whose name, as I after heard, was Renshaw, said he feared I would die before they could put me on board. Then they put me into a boat, and carried me on shipboard, where my wounds were dressed. I remained in the ship as near as I could reckon about 6 weeks, in which time I was indifferently recovered of my wounds and weaknesses. Then the master of the ship came in and told me, and the rest who were in the same condition, that he discovered 3 Turkish ships. We all offered to fight in defence of the ship and ourselves, but he commanded us to keep close, and said he would deal with them well enough. A little while after he called us up, and when we came on deck we saw 2 Turkish ships close by us. Into one of them we were put, and placed in a dark hold, where how long we continued before we were landed, I know not. When we were landed they led us 2 days' journey, and put us into a great house or prison, where we remained 4 days and a half, and then came to us 8 men to view us, who seemed to be officers. They called us and examined us of our trades and callings, which every one answered. One said he was a surgeon, another that he was a broadcloth weaver, and I, after 2 or 3 demands, said I had some skill in physic. We 3 were set by and taken by 3 of these 8 men who came to view us. It was my chance to be chosen by a grave physician of 87 years of age, who lived near Smyrna, who had formerly been in England, and knew Crowland in Lincolnshire, which he preferred before all others in England. He employed me to keep his still house, and gave me a silver bowl, double gilt, to drink in. My business was most in that place, but once he set me to gather cotton wool, which I not doing, he struck me to the ground, and after drew his stiletto to stab me. But I, holding up my hands to him, he gave me a stamp and turned from me, for which I render thanks to my Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, who stayed his hand and preserved me. I was there about 1 year and 3/4, and then my master fell sick on a Thursday, and sent for me, and calling me, as he used, by the name of Bell, told me he should die, and bid me shift for myself. He died on the Saturday following, and I instantly hastened with my bull to a port almost a day journey distant, the way to which place I knew, having been twice there employed by my master about the carriage of the cotton wool. When I came thither, I addressed myself to 2 men who came out of a ship of Hamburg, which, as they said, was bound for Portugal within 3 or 4 days. I inquired of them for an English ship. They answered there was none. I entreated them to take me into their ship, but they answered they durst not, for fear of being discovered by the searchers, which might occasion the forfeiture, not only of their goods, but also of their lives. I was very importunate with them, but could not prevail. They left me to wait on Providence, which at length brought me another out of the same ship, to whom I made known my condition, craving his assistance for my transportation. He made me the like answer as the former, and was as stiff in his denial, until the sight of my bowl put him to pause. He returned to the ship, and after an hour's space came back again, accompanied by another seaman, and for my bowl undertook to transport me. But he told me I must be contented to lie down in the keel, and endure much hardship, which I was content to do to gain my liberty. So they took me on board, and placed me below in the vessel, in a very uneasy place, and obscured me with boards and other things, where I lay undiscovered, notwithstanding the strict search that was made in the vessel. My 2 chapmen, who had my bowl, honestly furnished me with victuals daily, until we arrived at Lisbon in Portugal, where, as soon as the master had left the ship and was gone into the city, they set me on shore moneyless, to shift for myself. I knew not what course to take, but as Providence led me, I went up to the city, and came into a fair street, and being weary I turned my back to a wall, and leaned upon my staff. Over against me were 4 gentlemen discoursing together. After a while one of them came to me, and spake to me in a language that I understood not. I told him I was an Englishman, and understood not what he spoke. He answered me in plain English that he understood me, and was himself born in Wisbeck in Lincolnshire. Then I related to him my sad condition, and he, taking compassion on me, took me with him, provided me with lodging and a diet, and by his interest with a master of a ship bound for England, procured my passage, and bringing me on shipboard, he bestowed wine and strong waters on me, and at his return gave me 8 stivers, and commended me to the care of the master of the ship, who landed me safe at Dover. From thence I made a shift to get to London, where, being furnished with necessaries, I came into the country. Thus, honoured sir, I have given you a true account of my great sufferings and happy deliverance by the mercy and goodness of God, my most gracious Father, and Jesus Christ, my Saviour and Redeemer, to whose name be ascribed all honour, praise, and glory. I conclude and rest your worships in all dutiful respect. William Harrison. Before I part with this story, it is proper for me to remark that, though it does not contain any extraordinary mark of the wisdom of Providence, yet being in its nature strange, and hitherto having escaped any other collection, I thought it not improper to be preserved here, since some of the circumstances are of such a nature as not to be paralleled in any English story. End of chapter 42.
Chapter 44 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. A relation of the surprising discovery of the murder of Mary Barwick, committed by William Barwick, her husband, on the 14th of April, 1690, upon which he was convicted at the Lent Assizes at York, before the Honourable Sir John Powell, Knight, then one of the Judges of Assize. In the following relation I have kept strictly up to the motives which I have mentioned in the beginning of this appendix, and I hope that will atone for the inserting of this story, which I confess can be of no other use than to gratify the curiosity of the reader. As murder is one of the greatest crimes that man can be guilty of, so it is no less strangely and providentially discovered when secretly committed. The foul criminal believes himself secure, because there was no witness of the fact, not considering that the all-seeing eye of heaven beholds his iniquity, and by some means or other bringing it to light, never permits it to go unpunished. Indeed, so certainly does the revenge of God pursue the abominated murderer, that when witnesses are wanting of the fact, the very ghosts of the murdered parties cannot rest quiet in their graves until they have made the detection themselves. Of this we are now to give the reader two remarkable examples that lately happened in Yorkshire, and no less signal for the truth of both tragedies, as being confirmed by the trial of the offenders at the last assizes held for that county. The first of these murders was committed by William Barwick upon the body of Mary Barwick, his wife, at the same time big with child. What were the motives that induced the man to do this horrid fact does not appear by the examination of the evidence, or the confession of the party. Only it appeared upon his trial that he had got her with child before he married her, that being then constrained to marry her, he grew weary of her, which was the reason he was so willing to be rid of her, though he ventured body and soul to accomplish his design. The murder was committed on Palm Monday, being then the 14th of April, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at which time the said Barwick drilled his wife along until he came to a certain close, within sight of Cawa Castle, where he found the conveniency of a pond. He threw her by force into the water, and when she was drowned and drawn forth again by himself upon the bank of the pond, he had the cruelty to behold the motion of the infant yet warm in her womb. This done, he concealed the body, as it may readily be supposed, among the bushes that usually encompass a pond, and the next night when it grew dark, fetching a hay spade from a rick that stood in the close, he made a hole by the side of the pond, and there slightly buried the woman in her clothes. Having thus dispatched two at once, and thinking himself secure, because unseen, he went the same day to his brother-in-law, one Thomas Lofthouse of Rusforth, within 3 miles of York, who had married his drowned wife's sister, and told him he had carried his wife to one Richard Harrison's house in Selby, who was his uncle, and would take care of her. But heaven would not be so deluded, but raised up the ghost of the murdered woman to make the discovery. It was Easter Tuesday following, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that the aforementioned Lofthouse, having occasion to water a quickset hedge not far from his house, as he was going for the second pailful, an apparition went before him in the shape of a woman, and soon after sat down against a rising green grass plot, right over against the pond. He walked by her as he went to the pond, and as he returned with the pail from the pond, looking sideways to see whether she continued in the same place, he found she did, and that she seemed to dandle something in her lap that looked like a white bag, as he thought, which he did not observe before. So soon as he had emptied his pail, he went into his yard, and stood still to turn whether he could see her again. But she was vanished. In this information he says that the woman seemed to be habited in a brown-coloured petticoat, waistcoat, and a white hood, such a one as his wife's sister usually wore, and that her countenance looked extremely pale and wan, with her teeth in sight, but no gums appearing, and that her physiognomy was like that of his wife's sister, who was wife to William Barwick. But notwithstanding the ghastliness of the apparition, it seems it made so little impression on Lofthouse's mind that he thought no more of it, neither did he speak to anybody concerning it until the same night, as he was at family duty of prayers, when that apparition returned again to his thoughts, and discomposed his devotion, so that after he made an end of his prayers, he told the whole story of what he had seen to his wife, who, laying circumstances together, immediately inferred that her sister was either drowned or otherwise murdered, and desired her husband to look after her the next day, which was the Wednesday in Easter week. Upon this, Lofthouse, recollecting what Barwick had told him of his carrying his wife to his uncle at Selby, repaired to Harrison before mentioned, but found all that Barwick had said to be false, for Harrison had neither heard of Barwick nor his wife, neither did he know anything of them, which notable circumstance, together with that other of the apparition, increased his suspicion to that degree, that now concluding his wife's sister was murdered, he went to the Lord Mayor of York, and having obtained his warrant, he got Barwick apprehended, who was no sooner brought before the Lord Mayor, but his own conscience then accusing him, he acknowledged the whole matter, as it has been already related, and as it appears by the examination and confession herewith printed. On Wednesday, the 16th of September, 1690, the criminal, William Barwick, was brought to his trial before the Honourable Sir John Powell, Knight, one of the judges of the Northern Circuit, at the Assizes held at York, where the prisoner pleaded not guilty to his indictment. But upon the evidence of Thomas Lofthouse and his wife, and a third person, that the woman was found buried in her clothes, close by the pond side, agreeable to the prisoner's confession, and that she had several bruises on her head, occasioned by the blows the murderer had given her to keep her under water, and upon reading the prisoner's confession before the Lord Mayor of York, attested by the clerk who wrote the confession, and who swore the prisoner's owning and signing it for truth, he was found guilty and sentenced to death, and afterwards ordered to be hanged in chains. All the defence that the prisoner made was only this, that he was threatened into the confession that he had made, and it was in such a consternation that he did not know what he said or did. But then it was sworn, too, by 2 witnesses, that there was no such thing as any threatening made use of, but that he made a free and voluntary confession, only with this addition at first, that he told the Lord Mayor he had sold his wife for 5 shillings, but not being able to name either the person or the place where she might be produced, that was looked upon as too frivolous to outweigh circumstances that were too apparent. The examination of William Barwick, taken the 25th of April, 1690, who saith and confesseth that he carried his wife over a certain Wain bridge, called Bishop Dyke Bridge, between Cawood and Sherburn, and within a lane about 100 yards from the said bridge, and on the left hand of the said bridge he and his wife went over a stile on the left hand of a certain gate, entering into a certain close on the left hand of the said lane, and in a pond in the said close, adjoining to a quick wood hedge, he did drown his wife, and upon a bank of the said pond did bury her. And further, that he was within sight of Cawood Castle on the left hand, and there was but one hedge betwixt the said close where he drowned his wife, and the bishop's slates belonging to the said castle. William Barwick. Exam. Captain did etc. Anno super dictum. Coram me. S. Dawson, Mayor. End of chapter 43. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 44 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. Chapter 44. An account of the conviction and execution of Mr. Walker and Mark Sharp for the murder of Anne Walker. I am conscious that my collecting these relations may expose me to the raillery and ridicule of a very numerous tribe of wits in this age, who value themselves extremely on their contempt of supernatural stories and their disbelief of all things which relate to apparitions or returns from that state in which souls go when they depart from the body. Yet the following story is so remarkable, the proofs so exceedingly cognate, and the mistakes made in the relation of it by various authors so likely, notwithstanding, to bring it in the course of time into discredit, that I thought I could not do a greater service to the public than to preserve it in its genuine purity, which I have had occasion to retrieve from the side of some papers which related thereto, and from which the following account is written, verbatim, without any alteration, so much as in a letter. About the year 1631, there lived in a place called Chester in the Street, in the county Palatine of Durham, one Mr. Walker, a yeoman of good fortune and credit. He was a widower, and kept a young woman, one Ann Walker, a relation of his, in his house as housekeeper. It was suspected, it seems, by some of the neighbors that she was with child, immediately upon which she was removed to one Dame Cares, an aunt of hers, in the town of Lumley, hard by. The old woman treated her with much kindness and civility, but was exceedingly earnest to know of her who was the father of the child with which she went. But the young woman constantly avoided answering that question. But at last, perceiving how uneasy the old woman was, because she could get no knowledge how the poor babe was to be provided for, this Ann Walker at last said that he who got her with child would take care of both her and it, with which answer her aunt was tolerably satisfied. Some time after, of an evening, her old master Walker and one Mark Sharp, with whom he was extraordinarily intimate, came to her aunt's house and took the said Ann Walker away. About a fortnight passed without her being seen or heard of, and without much talk of the neighborhood concerning her, supposing she had been carried somewhere to be privately brought to bed, in order to escape her shame. But one James Graham, a miller, who lived 2 miles from the place where Walker's house was, being one night between the hours of 12 and 1, grinding corn in his mill, and the mill door shut, as he came downstairs from putting corn into the hopper, he saw a woman standing in the middle of the floor, with her hair all bloody, hanging about her ears, and 5 large wounds in her head. Graham, though he was a bold man, was exceedingly shocked at this spectacle. At last, after calling upon God to protect him, he, in a low voice, demanded who she was and what she wanted of him, to which the woman made answer, "I am the spirit of Ann Walker, who lived with Walker at Chester in the street, and being got with child by him, he promised to send me to a private place, where I should be well looked to until I was brought to bed, and well again, and then I should come to him again and keep his house. And I was accordingly, late one night, sent away with Mark Sharp, who upon the moor, just by the yellow bankhead, slew me with a pick, an instrument wherewith they dig coals, and gave me these 5 wounds, and afterwards threw me into a coal pit hard by, and hid the pick under the bank. His shoes and stockings also being bloody, he endeavored to wash them, but seeing the blood would not go forth, he hid them there too. And now, James Grime, so the country people pronounce Graham, I am come to you, that by revealing this bloody act, my murderers may be brought to justice, which unless you do, I will continually pursue and haunt you." The miller returned home to his house, very melancholy, and much astonished at this sight. Yet he held his peace, hoping that if he did not reveal it, she would go to somebody else. He was fearful of blasting the character of Mr. Walker, who was a man of substance, by telling such a tale concerning him to a justice of peace. However, he avoided as much as he was able being in the mill alone, especially at nights. But, notwithstanding all his care, and though other persons were not far off, she appeared to him there again, and in a harsh tone demanded why he had not made known what she had spoken of to him. He made her no answer, but fled to the other end of the place where the people were. Yet some little time after, just after sunset, she met him in his own garden, and spoke to him with such a cruel aspect, and with such fearful threats, that he promised to go the next morning to a magistrate, which he accordingly did. On the morrow, being St. Thomas's Day, he applied to a justice of the peace and told him the story. The justice, having tendered him his oath, and taking his information in writing, forthwith issued his warrant, and apprehended Mr. Walker and Mark Sharp, who by trade was a collier, that is, dug coals out of a mine. They made light of the thing before the justice, although he in the meanwhile had caused a place, which Graham said the apparition had spoken of, to be searched, and there found the dead body, wounded in place and manner as before described, with the pick, the shoes, and the stockings. However, Walker and Sharp were admitted to bail, and at the next assizes appeared upon their trial. Judge Davenport heard the several circumstances of the woman's being carried out by Sharp, her being suspected to be with child by her master, Walker, and the story which Graham repeated exactly upon oath, as he had done before the justice. The foreman of the jury did depose that he saw a child standing upon the shoulders of the prisoner Walker at the bar, and the judge himself was under such a concern and uneasiness that as soon as the jury had found the prisoners guilty, he immediately rose up and passed sentence of death upon them, a thing never known before nor since in Durham, the custom being not to pass sentence until the close of the assizes. End of chapter 44.
Chapter 45 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. The life of Jacques Perrier, a French robber and murderer. As I have stepped in the former stories a little back in time, so in this I shall make bold to go out of our own nation to relate a very extraordinary passage which happened at Paris in the beginning of the last century, because it will serve as a notable instance of that confusion and fear which guilt brings over the souls of the most hardened villains, and thereby renders them often instruments of justice upon themselves, so that it seems not virtue only is its own reward, but vice also brings upon itself those torments which it ought to feel. Thus Providence ordereth, with inscrutable wisdom, that every man should feel happiness or misery, according as his own demeanour serves. But it is now time that we hearken to the story. It happened that a certain architect, who was in high esteem with the greatest nobles in France for his excellent skill in building after the Italian model, and had thereby obtained both a great reputation and a large estate, being a generous and charitable man, took into his house one Jacques Perrier, in the nature of an accountant, for the better ordering of his affairs. For the 6 years that this Jacques lived in his master's house, never any man was known to behave better or more commendably than he did. At length he married and had children, so that the master, looking upon him as a staid, discreet person, of whose fidelity he had indubitable proofs, he therefore gave him the charge of everything, when he went to a country house of his, a small distance from Paris, where he sometimes stayed for a week or so to unbend his mind and enjoy the benefit of the summer season. At last, Jacques, observing what great wealth he had acquired, began to be covetous and desirous of obtaining it, and after having cast it long in his head how he might obtain it, he at length resolved with himself to join with certain villains who at that time robbed in the streets and committed murders on the roads about Paris. Gaining notice of a house where such people frequented, he found ways and means to be admitted into the room where they had their consultations, and the person who introduced him having promised for his fidelity, they listened very attentively to the proposal which he promised to make them, and which, after a little pause, he performed in these words: "My good friends, it is now upwards of 6 years since I have lived in the service of a rich and eminent person. I thought that before this time I might have made my fortune under him, and therefore have hitherto served him faithfully and honestly. But finding my expectations herein deceived, I come to make you an offer which may enrich you all. He has a house in the country, whither he retires with his daughter and maidservant only. These may easily be dispatched, and then all his effects will be our own. I will venture to assure you they will be worth 10,000 crowns. The thieves were not a little rejoiced at the thoughts of so extraordinary a booty, and therefore, after returning Perrier thanks, they readily embraced his motion, and promised him whatever assistance he should require. It was not long before the unfortunate gentleman went as usual with his daughter and her maid to enjoy the pleasures of his rural habitation, leaving the direction of his affairs to Jacques, who no sooner saw him safe out of Paris, but he went to give notice to his associates that the time was now come to execute his bloody proposal. They quickly got all things in readiness, and as soon as it was evening, set out under the command of this desperate varlet to commit that horrible murder which he had contrived. Arriving at the house, Perrier knocked at the door. The maid, knowing him, supposed some extraordinary business had brought him thither, and readily opened the door. But she was exceedingly surprised to find him followed by 5 ruffians, oddly dressed, masked, and with large staves in their hands. However, they did not give her much time to consider, but followed her immediately into the kitchen, where, by the direction of their abominable leader, they immediately, with many cruel blows, put her to death. From thence they went upstairs into the old gentleman's apartment, and found him sitting upon his bed. As soon as they entered, "Perrier," said his master, "is it thus that you return that kindness with which I have always treated you? Did I not take you from misery and want? Have I not maintained you, and put it in your power to maintain your family? Will you repay this my charity with robbing me of all I have? Must the tenderness I have shown towards you draw upon me death from your hands? And do you not think that the same God who hath seen me cherish and relieve you will not bring upon you condign punishment for this execrable villainy thou art going to commit?" Perrier was sensible of the truth of what he said, but knowing it was impossible for him to go back, he gave a sign to the murderers to fall about the execution of their work. But the old man, who was too wise to expect mercy from their hands, endeavoured to lay hold of a halbert which stood in his room, designing therewith, as well as he could, to defend himself. But before he could get it into his hands, the villains struck him down, and with 30 or 40 wounds gave a passage for his soul into a better life. The unfortunate young lady lay in the next room to her father's, and being already got to bed, heard with astonishment the execrable fact. However, full of fear and astonishment, she covered herself with the bedclothes, and endeavoured all she was able to hide herself in the bed. But, alas, her caution was to small purpose. Perrier knew too well the situation of all things to be deceived by so trivial an artifice, and therefore, after pulling the bedclothes into the middle of the floor, he exposed, naked to his fellow ruffians, the most beautiful young lady in France. In vain she fell upon her knees, and with all that tender elocution so natural to their sex when in distress, besought them that they would spare her life, which, as she said, could be of no benefit to them, and could only serve to increase the number of their sins. But they were too much flushed in cruelty and blood to give any attention to her entreaties, and so, without respect either to the softness of her sex or to her tender age, with a shower of blows from their clubs they laid her dead upon the floor. Being thus become master of the house, Perrier took the keys, and opening the several apartments, disclosed to them all the riches of his deceased master. They immediately brought away all the ready money they found in the house, which amounted to little less than 10,000 crowns. All the rich movables they conveyed away to a boat which they had prepared for that purpose, and had fastened in a creek of the river on a bank of which the house stood. They loaded and unloaded this vessel 5 or 6 times, for there was no hurry in carrying away the goods, seeing it was the dead time of the night, and when they had thoroughly plundered it of everything that would yield money, they then came away and went to the place where they laid up their spoils. There it was resolved to divide the booty, and Perrier claimed the largest share, as well in right of his having put them upon that project, as that he had assisted more strenuously in the execution of it than any of them. For when men associate themselves to commit wickedness, he who surpasses the rest in villainy claims the same reward, and from the same reasons, as he who in another society surpasses all his neighbours in virtue. When this execrable fact was over, and he had secured his share in the plunder, he returned home to the house of his master, and remained in carrying on the ordinary course of business of his master. About 2 days after, it happened that a man who had business with the old gentleman called at his country house, and after knocking a good while at the door, finding that nobody answered, he went to town, and meeting with Jacques Perrier at his master's house, he told him of his calling upon him in the country, and that he found nobody there. Jacques counterfeited the greatest surprise at the news, and calling many assistants, went down immediately to his master's seat, and with all the seeming horror imaginable, became a second time a witness of those barbarities which he and his villainous associates had committed. At the sight of the murdered maid in the kitchen, he cried out with the greatest vehemence, and seemed in an agony of sorrow. But when he saw the body of his master, he roared and stamped, he cried out, tore his hair, and threw himself upon the body, as if he had never more intended to have drawn breath. All the persons he had carried with him were effectually deceived by his behaviour, and were under apprehensions lest his too violent grief should throw him into a fever, or prompt him to lay hands upon himself. He was not contented with acting thus upon the spot, but resolved to play it over again when he came back to Paris. There abundance of people pitied him, and looked on him as one whom the sincere love he had for his master had drawn to the utmost despair by reason of his unfortunate death. But one of the old gentleman's relations, who was a man of more penetration than the rest, began to suspect his excessive affliction, and by his arguments drew another gentleman, who was also interested in the family affairs, to be of his opinion, whereupon Jacques was apprehended on suspicion and sent to prison. Solitude and confinement are often the roads to repentance and confession, for the vanities of the world being no longer before them, in such cases people are apt to retire into the recesses of their own breasts, and having no avocations from considering how they have spent their former years, the reflection often extorts truth which would never be by any other method discovered. But it was not so with Perrier. His dissimulation was of a stronger contexture, and not to be broken even by sorrow and confinement. He not only continued to deny the knowledge of the murder, but also to lament the loss of so indulgent a master, with such floods of tears and so many strong appearances of real sorrow and affection, that, no proof appearing against him, the magistrates were afraid of having themselves reproached with injustice if they had not given him his liberty, to which, after 6 months' imprisonment, he was restored. The rest of the assassins, seeing a long space of time elapsed, and that still not the least discovery was made of the murder, laid aside all fears of being taken, and began to appear more openly than hitherto they had done since the perpetration of that fact. But in the midst of their security, the providence of God forced them to betray themselves. For as the father, son, and cousin, who were all concerned in the murder, were sitting with one maçon, another of the confederates, with one mason, making merry at a public house, on a sudden they turned their heads and saw 10 or 12 archers, or marshal's men, who have the same authority as constables in our country, who by chance met together and came into the house to drink. Guilt, on a sudden, struck the whole company with apprehensions that they were come in search of them, the fear of which made them throw down their knives and forks, leave what they had upon the table, and fly with the utmost precipitation, as supposing they ran for their lives. This extravagant behaviour struck the archers with amazement, and immediately calling for the landlord, they inquired of him what should be the sudden cause of this terror in his guests. He replied that it was impossible for him to tell certainly, but from discourse which he had heard, he took them to be persons of no very honest character, and from the great sums of money he had heard them count out, he was apprehensive that they had committed some robbery or other. There wanted not any farther account to stir up the archers to a pursuit, from whence they already assured themselves they should be considerable gainers, the thing speaking for itself, since honest people are not used to fall into such panics. But only guilt creates apprehensions in men at the sight of the ministers of justice. Immediately, therefore, the officers pursued them in the road they had taken, and the old man being less able to travel than the rest, in about 2 hours' time they came up with him at the side of a rivulet, where, for very weariness, he had stopped, as not being able to cross it. No sooner did they come up to him but he surrendered, and fear having brought a sudden repentance, he, without any equivocation, began to confess all the crimes of his life. He said that it was true they all of them deserved death, and he was content to suffer. He said, moreover, that in the course of his life he had murdered upwards of 60 with his own hands. He also carried the officers to an island in the river, which was the usual place of the execution of those innocents who fell into the hands of their gang, and acknowledged that of all the offences he had committed, nothing gave him so much pain as the having murdered a hopeful young gentleman for the sake of a trifle of money which he had about him, by putting a stone about his neck and sinking him in the water. Of the other 3, 2 were apprehended, but the third made his escape, and was running hastily with the news to Jacques Perrier and their other companions, but he was soon after seized and carried to prison with the rest, none escaping from the hands of justice but Masson and the cruel Perrier, the author of all this mischief. The 3 who were in prison endured the torture with the greatest constancy, absolutely denying that they knew anything of the murders and robberies which had been committed. Yet when they were confronted by the old man, their courage deserted them, they acknowledged the fact, and judgment was pronounced upon them that they should be broke alive upon the wheel, before the house of the unfortunate architect whom they had murdered. When they were brought there, with a strong guard, to suffer that punishment to which the law had so justly doomed them, they appeared to be very penitent and sorrowful for their crimes, and one of them in particular did, with greatest vehemency, beseech the pardon of Almighty God, of the king his sovereign, and of the people whom he had so much injured, declaring that he could not die in peace without informing the multitude who were assembled to behold their execution of a certain kind of villainy in which he was particularly concerned. He said it was his custom to watch about the sides of the road which lay near the woods, and that having a cord with him, he suddenly threw it about the neck of any passenger who was coming by, and therewith immediately strangled him before he was aware or capable of resisting them. And if at any time there came by several passengers together who demanded what he did there, he replied that he was sent thither by his master to catch a cow, and his going in the habit of a peasant gave such an aspect of truth to the story that he was never suspected. Though the concourse of people be generally very great, yet the assembly on this occasion was much larger than ordinary, and those who were spectators, contrary to the ordinary custom, showed but very little compassion at the miserable tortures which those wretches endured. On the contrary, they continually cried out that they should discover what was become of Perrier and their other accomplice, Masson. These unfortunate men continued to assert in their last moments that they knew nothing of either of them, but supposed that, hearing of their apprehension, they had immediately made their escape, and were retired as far as they were able from the danger. The people were infinitely satisfied with the death of these assassins, and nothing was wanting to complete the triumph of justice but the apprehension of Perrier and his associate, to whose adventures it is now time that we return, in order to display the severe justice of Providence, and the admirable methods by which it disappoints all the courses that human wit can invent in order to frustrate its intent. Masson had hid himself in a village not far from the city of Tours, where he concealed himself so effectually that the inhabitants had not the least suspicion of his being a dishonest man. On the contrary, he applied himself to an honest way of getting his livelihood, and after sojourning there for a considerable space, he married a young woman with the consent of her parents, and seemed to be now established in a state of peace and security, if it were possible for a guilty soul to know either security or peace. A trivial accident, in which no man but Masson would have had a hand, proved the instrument by which he was drawn to suffering that cruel death which his companions had before undergone, and he so justly deserved. There was, it seems, a young country fellow in the neighbourhood where Masson lived, who was just married, and according to a silly notion which prevails not only among the peasants of France, but also among the clowns of all other nations in Europe, fancied himself bewitched by some charm or other, which rendered him incapable of performing the rites of his marriage bed. Masson thereupon offered, if he would give him a reasonable gratuity, to free him from this insupportable malady, and a bargain was accordingly struck for 4 crowns, 2 of which the fellow gave him in his hand, and 2 more were to be paid on the accomplishment of the cure, when there were no more complaints of insufficiency. Upon this, he immediately demanded the other 2 crowns, which the other refused, and our infatuated thief brought the cause before the magistrates, where, when it came to be examined, it appeared plainly that Masson had bragged to his companions that he had wrought the charm, for the undoing of which he now claimed a reward, and, as the justice of the court required, he was sentenced to be banished as a sorcerer, after being first whipped at all the cross streets in town. But behold the marvellous conduct of divine justice. He appealed from this sentence to the Parliament at Paris, whither he was no sooner conducted under a strong guard, but he was immediately known to be one of that gang of assassins which had been executed for the murder of Perrier's master and family. Immediately he was charged with this fact, and the heirs of that unfortunate gentleman prosecuted their charge with such vigour that he received the like judgment, to be broken alive upon the wheel at the same place where his associates had suffered death, which sentence was rigorously executed 5 years after the perpetration of that execrable fact. There remained nobody but Jacques Perrier, the author and contriver of this horrid villainy, who had not suffered according to their deserts. He, after hiding himself for a while, until he saw what became of his companions, hastily betook himself to flight, and endeavoured to fly into England, where, if he once arrived, he knew he should remain in safety. But in this attempt he was disappointed, although nobody pursued him, for being arrived at Calais, the same covetous and wicked disposition which had prompted him to murder so kind a master and all his family, egged him on to rob a certain rich merchant there, which villainous design he effected whilst the gentleman was at church. But he gained not much by that, for the booty being too large to be concealed, he was very quickly apprehended, and for this fact condemned to be hanged. He had more wit, however, than his companion Masson, and therefore never dreamt of appealing to the Parliament of Paris, where he knew he should meet with the same fate which had befallen the rest of the gang. However, when he came to suffer that death which was appointed him by law, he did not stick, to acknowledge that execrable parricide which he had projected, as well as carried into execution, so that, when the news reached Paris, it occasioned universal joy that not one of these bloody villains had escaped, but were so wonderfully cut off when they themselves fancied the danger to be over. The French author from whom I have transcribed this account hath swelled the relation with much of that false eloquence which was so common in the last age, not only in France, but throughout all Europe. Except that I have rejected this, I have been very faithful in this translation, the story appearing to me to be very extraordinary in its kind, and worthy therefore of being known to the public, since it will sufficiently declare that as vice prevails generally throughout all countries and climates, stirring up men to cruel and atrocious deeds, so the eye of Providence is continually watchful, and suffers not the blood of innocents to cry out for revenge in vain. It remains that I inform my readers that this villainy was transacted about the year 1611, and that Masson and Jacques Perrier suffered in the year 1616. End of chapter 45.
Chapter 46 of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals, Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward. The lives of Abraham White, Francis Sanders, John Mines, alias Minsham, alias Mitchell, and Constance Buckle, thieves and housebreakers. Of these unfortunate lads, Abraham White was born of mean parents, who had it not in their power to give him much education, but taught him, however, the business of a bricklayer, which was his father's trade, and by which doubtless, if he had been careful, he might have got his bread. But he unfortunately addicting himself from childhood to drinking and lewd company, soon plunged himself into all manner of wickedness, and quickly brought on a fatal necessity of stepping into the road of the gallows, and associating himself with Sanders and Minsham. They had all gone together upon the road for about 6 weeks before they were taken. Francis Sanders was a young fellow of very tolerable arts and education. He had been put out apprentice to a staymaker, attained to a great proficiency in his trade, and by the help of his friends, who were very willing to lend him their assistance, he might have done very well in the world, if it had not been for that unfortunate inclination to roving, which continually possessed him. His acquaintance with a certain bad woman was in all probability the first cause of his addicting himself to ill courses, and as in the papers I have before me relating to him, her history is also contained. I thought it would not be unentertaining to my readers if I ventured to insert it. This woman's true name was Mary Smith. She was brought up, while young, from her native country of Yorkshire to London, where getting into the service of an eminent shopkeeper, she might, had she been honest and industrious, have lived easily and with credit. But unfortunately both for herself and her master's apprentice, the young man took a liking to her, and one night, having first taken care to make himself master of the key of her door, he came out of his chambers into hers, where after a faint resistance he got to bed to her. Their correspondence was carried on for a good while without suspicion, but the young man having one night stole a bottle of rum with a design that it should make his mistress and he merry together before they went to bed, they inconsiderately drank so heartily of it that the next morning they slept so sound that their master and mistress came upstairs at 10 o'clock and found them in bed together. Upon this the wench, without more ado, was turned out of doors, and was forced to live at an alehouse of ill repute, where Sanders used to come of an evening, and so got acquainted with her. John Minsham was an unfortunate wretch, born of mean parents, and equally destitute of capacity or education. From the time he had been able to crawl alone, he had known scarce any other home than the street. Shoeblacks and such like vagabonds were his constant companions, and the only honest employment he ever pretended to was that of a hackney coachman, which the brethren of the whip had taught him out of charity. Thus furnished with bad principles, and every way fitted for those detestable practices into which they precipitated themselves, they first got into one another's company at a dram shop near St. Giles in the Fields, much frequented by Constance Buckle, a most lewd and abandoned strumpet, and one Roland Jones, a fellow of as bad principles as themselves. One night, having intoxicated themselves with the vile manufacture of the house, they went out, after they had spent their money, and in Bloomsbury Square attacked one John Ross, from whom they took away a hat of value 5 shillings and 4pence, halfpenny in money. This man, it seems, lived the very next door to the gin shop where they frequented. Going there the next day to make complaint, he was immediately told that the people who had robbed him had sold his hat, and were coming thither by and by to drink the money out in gin. Upon this information, Ross procured proper assistance, and the people, keeping their appointment pretty exactly, were all surprised and taken. In the confusion they were under when first apprehended, Minsham and Sanders in part owned the fact, but Roland Jones, making a full and frank discovery, was accepted as an evidence, and produced against them at their trial at the ensuing sessions of the Old Bailey, where, upon full evidence, they were all convicted of this fact, and Francis Sanders, Constance Buckle, and Robert Tyler were indicted for assaulting Richard Smith on the highway, putting him in fear, and taking from him a hat of value 5 shillings. Roland Jones, the evidence, deposed that the night of the robbery was committed he was in company with the prisoners at a brandy shop, where, having drunk until they were all pretty much elevated, they went out in order to see what they could pick up, and not far from the place they went from, overtaking a man whom they saw had a pretty good hat on, Sanders hit him a blow in the face, and then, not doing the business, he repeated it, and at the second blow the hat fell off from his head, whereupon Constance Buckle caught it and clapped it under her coat. The constable deposed that by the information of Roland Jones he apprehended the prisoners. Constance Buckle acknowledged that she was in their company when the man was knocked down and the hat taken, whereupon the jury, without withdrawing, found them guilty, and they received sentence of death. The woman Constance Buckle pleaded her being with child, and a jury of matrons being impanelled, they found she was quick, and thereby procured her a respite of execution, and soon after her sentence was changed to transportation. The rest, under conviction, behaved themselves very indifferently, and manifested sufficiently that, though custom and an evil disposition might make them bold in the commission of robberies, yet when death looked them steadily and unavoidably in the face, all that resolution forsook them, and in their last moments they behaved with all the appearances of terror which are usually seen in souls just awakened to a due sense of their own guilt. They died on the 23rd of December, 1730, White being 18, Sanders near 18, and Minsham 16 years of age. End of chapter 46. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. End of Lives of the Most Remarkable Criminals who have been condemned and executed for murder, the highway, housebreaking, street robberies, coining, or other offences. Volume 3, by Arthur L. Hayward.